Good evening. The polls are closed and our politicians might just be getting nervous, waiting for the verdict of millions of you who've been voting today in this year's council elections. Power is up for grabs and reputations are on the line. Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister in the autumn after the turmoil that brought down Boris Johnson and saw off Liz Truss. But in a year, Mr Sunak might be fighting his own general election. So what will the public say about him and his party tonight? Sir Keir Starmer spent this morning bashing the phones, reminding people to vote. He has been miles ahead in the opinion polls, but now real ballots have been cast. Can he rely on the same support? How close is Labour really to number 10? The Lib Dems want to get the big wheels turning. Their leader, Sir Ed Davey, used a tractor on the campaign trail to smash through a metaphorical wall of Tory support. But in the next few hours, we will know if he's actually been able to turn blue seats yellow. These elections will decide who runs more than 230 English councils. But they'll also give us the biggest picture of public opinion since Rishi Sunak took over, and possibly the last before the general election. Reeta Chakrabarti's here to help us crunch the numbers. Reeta.
I'll be analysing the results as they come in. These are the seats that each party is defending. We'll see how those numbers change overnight.
Professor Sir John Curtice will, of course, steer us through the tips and trends as the night goes on. And our political editor, Chris Mason, will help us figure out what it might all mean for those vying for power. Some of them will be with us live. Politicians join us here and from around the country. So stick with us. It is election night on the BBC, and some of those all-important results have already started to come in. A very warm welcome to you for election 2023. Tens of millions of you have had the chance to have your say in England today after a wild political year. It's the first time that the ballot boxes have been out since the exit of Boris Johnson, the implosion of Liz Truss and the arrival in number 10 of Rishi Sunak, not so long after he became an MP in 2015. These elections are a reflection on his short time in office so far, but of course, local elections do what they say on the tin as well. They decide who runs the authorities that have big responsibilities for things that are important in our lives. Schools, care, of course, the bins. So the results are a judgment on what's going right or wrong locally, as well as what's happened in Westminster. And we have, even at this start of the programme, had some results already. We've got 6 seats in. Guess where? From Sunderland. Of course, the part of the country where the counters are always the fastest first. I think we've actually just had the 7th result come in, but we can see there in our giant tower, Labour have got 6 seats, taking 2, the Lib Dems 1. And an interesting thing there, 2 of those seats in Labour wards have been taken from UKIP, who did very well the last time. We're going to be out and about around the country throughout the night. Look, the counters there hard at work in Leicestershire. I think we can show you some pictures also of Stoke, which is the kind of part of the country where politicians have been falling all over themselves to press the flesh with voters, and Medway in the southeast, counting underway there too. So we'll be checking in with our teams on the ground. I think we've got BBC representatives at about 50 counts, so we'll hear from right across England. Let's start tonight though. Chris, tell us for each of the main leaders then. Let's start with the Prime Minister, his first big test. What's on the line for Rishi Sunak?
A lot's on the line because it's the kind of first verdict for him of the election, as it is for any political leader, isn't it, on a night like this? Because for all of the focus that there is at Westminster, inevitably on opinion polls, they can be dismissed by a political leader saying, well, you know, it's just an opinion poll. These are real votes in real ballot boxes, electing real politicians who'll be running vital public services. And that matters, obviously, at a local level in terms of who provides those services, but it matters massively to the mood of the national parties. Now, what Rishi Sunak has managed to do in stabilising the Conservative Party over the last 6 or 7 months is push back any sense within the party that they're in the mood to start another civil war. But it matters massively for him and for the government to give them a sense of how they are faring. and obviously for the other parties as well, in particular for Labour. So when you look at what the parties are saying, Conservatives are expecting to go backwards, Labour are expecting to go forwards, as are the Liberal Democrats and the Greens in places as well. But in that Conservative-Labour tussle, it's going to be about extent. To what extent do the Conservatives go backwards? To what extent do Labour go forwards? And therefore, how do the parties feel by tomorrow tea time, when we've got a proper sense of the spread of the results, in terms of what it may or may not mean for the general election expected next year?
So for Rishi Sunak, he's got to show the extent to which he's been able to slow the decline. For Keir Starmer, where's the pressure? Because he's been miles ahead in those national opinion polls for such a long time, but it's whether that's real. What happens in the real world? Exactly.
Is it real? So he has managed, and Labour have managed, to find themselves in the last 6-7 months in a position via those opinion polls that they could have never dreamt of just a couple of years ago, given the whacking that they took at the last general election. But so much about the psychology of politics is a sense of momentum. And if you have, as Labour have had in the last 6 months, massive opinion poll leads, and then you get real votes in real ballot boxes, and maybe, let's see, it's not quite as big as that, then that will be tricky, I guess, psychologically, because there might be a sense of maybe it's not as strong as they might have thought it might be. And that's why you're already getting, on my phone, the spin coming in from the various parties. Lots of comparisons. This sounds quite wholesome, but hey, it's an election night. It's a wholesome analysis we can throw in. There's lots of comparisons already being made with 1995, with local elections in 1995, where there was a massive gap. Labour were doing incredibly well, the Conservatives doing very badly a couple of years before Labour did very well at a general election. And the parallels will be drawn with tonight and any prospective result come next year in the
Well, if you're a nerd like you and me, then it has been a favourite parlour game to play. I'm sure some of you have played that at home if you're watching a local election programme at nearly midnight. Is this 1991? Where Labour went on to lose in 1992? Or is it 1995 when, of course, they went on to have a landslide? I'm sure we'll get to that discussion at some point in the night. One little snippet hearing of significant potential Labour gains in Plymouth, where they've been busy and very hopeful of trying to take that council back, but we'll be there on the ground and thinking about that later on. But where else should we be looking out for? Reeta, where should we look?
There's so much going on tonight, Laura. Just want to show you, first of all, the seats that each party is defending. Got a quick snapshot right at the top of the programme. The Conservatives are defending 3,300 or so, Labour on just over 2,000 and the Lib Dems 1,200. But the councils that we are going to be watching overnight, these are the councils that each of the three main parties are defending. These over here are hung. Let's start with the Conservatives. We've got Brentwood at the top of the list, Brentwood in Essex. And it's top because it is a very marginal council for the Conservatives. They have a majority of 3 seats, and it's the Liberal Democrats who are their main opponents here. The Lib Dems used to run this council in the 1990s, and last year they started nibbling away into the Conservatives' support. So we'll be watching that very closely. The Lib Dems are also the main opposition in Windsor and in South Gloucestershire. So Windsor and Maidenhead, Theresa May's constituency seat. South Gloucestershire is near Bristol. Both those councils, there's a big challenge being launched by the Liberal Democrats. Then in northwest Leicestershire, which is around Ashby de la Zouch, and East Lindsey, which is in Lincolnshire, around Skegness, the Conservatives are in danger of losing those councils to no overall control. And then there's a whole swathe of councils in this Conservative list, which are Conservative now, but used to be Labour under Tony Blair. And they include Harlow, Tamworth, Basildon, Redditch, Medway, Dudley. And for Labour, the challenge is to see whether they can really come back in these councils, either take them or significantly improve on their performance, if we're to believe that they are indeed on their way back to national power. Under the Labour councils, Bolsover at the top. That is a Labour council in Derbyshire. It is where Dennis Skinner was the MP for many, many years, but there is now a Conservative MP since the last general election. Stevenage is Labour as well, and has been since the 1970s. But in 2021, the Labour Party lost 5 seats to the Conservatives there. So there clearly is some volatility going on there. Exeter, Lincoln's interesting too. So that has been Labour since 2011. But at the general election, they lost the seat to the Conservatives, and it's a fairly marginal seat. The MP has a majority of about 3,500. So that is an area where Labour wants to be coming back quite strongly. For the Liberal Democrats, we've got Hull at the top because it's an ultra-marginal for them. They have a majority of 1 seat there. They took this council from Labour last year, so Labour is going to be taking the challenge to the Lib Dems there. In North Devon and in Cotswold, the Lib Dems have a small majority as well of just 2 seats. So we'll be watching those very closely. And among the hung councils, well, Plymouth is a top Labour target, as Laura's just said. Portsmouth, a top Lib Dem target. And a word for these 3 councils down here at the bottom: Rochford in Essex, West Lindsey and Boston in Lincolnshire. They're all hung, but they were Conservative at the last election, and they've become hung through defections. So we'll have to wait and see whether the Conservatives can take them back. So a great deal to be watching. Laura.
So thanks very much. I'm glad you're here to keep us right through all of that detail and that map of the country and all of those graphics there. Now, in a couple of minutes, we're going to hear from our political guests. I want to introduce them. Paul Scully, Technology Minister in the government. Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, wants to be the Labour Health Secretary if you're lucky enough to win the general election. And Sarah Olney, who's here for the Liberal Democrats. Welcome to all of you. We'll hear from them in a few minutes' time. The first hold of a council has just come in. Halton, which is in Cheshire, but the sort of Liverpool side of Cheshire, that's been held by the Labour Party. Not a surprise, but that's the first council hold result to come in tonight. Let's take a closer look, though, at what's been happening in Sunderland. Now, they are still counting there. There's still 14 seats to declare. Now, that's somewhere where Labour was always going to be the biggest party, but they were very desirous, really wanting to show progress. They've got 37 seats there, 12 to the Liberal Democrats, 10 to the Conservatives. You can see that Labour have gained 2, and UKIP, of course, who were standing candidates in 2019, were down 2. So an interesting result there in Sunderland. Let's hear from somebody with a giant brain who's going to help us with all of this through the night, Sir John Curtice. Now, just from that initial result, John, does that tell us anything or suggest anything in a wider sense at this stage of the night?
It does. We've got results, actually, most, as you said, from Sunderland. We've also got a couple from Newcastle. Now, one is a very Remain voting area, viz Newcastle, the other very Leave voting area, viz Sunderland. So what we're looking, however, is pretty consistently in these wards is a swing from Conservative to Labour of around the order of 5% typically as compared with 2019, and also certainly 3 or 4 points as compared with last year. So it's very early doors, but certainly the expectations of the opinion polls, which were that indeed the Labour Party was going to make a significant advance in these local elections, and perhaps with a capital P at this stage, on a scale that might be commensurate with what we would expect from the opinion polls, that so far at least looks possible for the results in Newcastle and Sunderland. I think one other thing we should point out to people is the turnout is down, both as compared with last year and as compared with 2019. Now, of course, again, it's early picture, but if that were to continue, then I think we might begin to get some discussion during the course of the night about whether or not the requirement to show voter ID has in fact had an impact on the level of participation in these local elections.
I'm sure we will discuss that. In fact, there's already been a statement from the Electoral Commission about that, and there've been lots of anecdotal reports of things going on around in the country, and we'll do our best to give people a full picture of what effect the introduction of voter ID at these elections has actually had on people. But John, before we get into the debate with the politicians, give us what the real benchmarks we should be looking for.
Yeah, well, you'll have heard a great deal, Laura, about the seats that will be gained or lost. But what we have to very gently point out is that of the 8,000 seats that are up for election today, 5,000 of them are in the relatively small shire Tory districts, which are certainly not typical of the country as a whole. Many of them have whole council elections, where as a result, Each ward is not just electing one councillor, but 2 or 3. So quite small shifts of votes can result in quite dramatic shifts of seats. So the picture created by seats gained and lost is frankly at risk of not giving us a clear impression of what's going on in England, let alone what the implications might be more broadly. So in the end, and I'm afraid this isn't something we'll be able to do tonight, but in the end we will need to look at the votes and to try to turn those votes into a measure we use every year, the so-called BBC projected national share, which is our attempt to say, well, look, if the whole of the country had had local elections on Thursday, given the way that people behaved in the places that did have local elections, what do we think the result would be? And the point about that is we are then no longer comparing with what happened in 2019, which, by the way, was a very unusual year with both Conservative and Labour doing badly. But rather, we can then compare across the piece. And as Chris Mace has been pointing out, some people are quite keen, not quite sure why, to make a comparison with 1995, but doubtless we will get to that at some point. But the crucial thing perhaps here to point out is the opinion polls are saying Labour are now in a stronger position relative to the Conservatives than they have been at any point since 2010. So certainly the simplest of benchmarks is to say, well, if Labour are going to prove that they are in a better position, then they should, on the PNS measure, be doing better than at any point since 2010. Well, our viewers might want to take note that the best performance by Labour since 2010 was under Med Miliband in 2012 when there was 7 points ahead. But we might also point out that, and this gets us back to 1995, before Tony Blair won in 1997, Labour regularly had double-digit leads of varying sizes. The Conservatives also, by the way, had double-digit leads under David Cameron before 2010. So I think if Labour really want to demonstrate that they really are breaking through amongst the electorate, then they would probably like to be at least in double-digit territory. But I'm afraid it'll be a long time before we'll be able to give you a clear idea of what's going on. In the meantime, if you hear us talking about swings from Conservative Labour of 5, 6, 7%, you will know that Labour are doing pretty well.
OK, I'm sure we'll get into that in a few minutes with our political panel, but I want to take you around the country and show you some pictures of what's going on at the Medway count. Thousands and thousands of people across the country busily tonight getting on, cracking open the ballot boxes, that magical moment where the decisions that you made actually translated into real results. Keir Starmer has been in Medway. There he was. I think he was there yesterday. And when you see a political leader in a part of the country, that means it is somewhere they are hopeful of taking, because they don't waste their time going to places where they don't think they've got a hope. And it is somewhere where they want to be seen pressing the flesh. And our reporter, Anna Collinson, is there in Medway for us tonight. Anna, tell us, what's the significance of that part of the country?
Yeah, good evening, Laura. So welcome to a very bustling count in Gillingham. We're expecting it to be a very long night of counting, expected not to get a result until around 6 or 7 a.m. The returning officer said right at the beginning, while speed is important, accuracy is more so. So everyone's sort of taking heed of his words. For those who don't know that much about Medway, what you really need to know is, aside from a blip in the 90s, it really has been dominated by the Conservatives since the 70s, and the local authority has been in power for 20 years. It's got 3 local MPs, all Conservative, as is its mayor. But as you mentioned, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party see this as a really ambitious target. Keir Starmer came here on his first day of campaigning and also was here yesterday afternoon, hours before polls opened, with Angela Rayner, his deputy leader. They see this as a really important area for them to take hold of. I've been speaking to some Labour activists who've told me that they've said they've been speaking to people on the door, a lot of lifelong Tory voters who say that they've turned their backs on the Conservatives. They won't be voting Tory this time after everything that's happened with Boris Johnson and Partygate and with Liz Truss and the emergency budget. There's also a sense of quite a lot of voter apathy, and that is a concern for the Labour activists here tonight, that there might be a low turnout and people might not turn out.
And Anna, just tell us quickly, have you heard anything, even anecdotally, about voter ID? That might be a theme of the night, but from your conversations with people being on the ground, have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When I was in Midway yesterday, I did one walk from one end to the other, and I asked every single person whether they were going to vote or not about photo ID, and every single person knew they needed it. So that was my sort of anecdotal, very unscientific take on what's going on. But I was speaking to a Labour activist this evening, and he said that he was very concerned about the voter ID, that people had told them that they wouldn't be voting because they didn't have the ID, and he was worried they wouldn't appear in the data. So that's what I've heard from one person tonight on that.
OK, Anna, thanks very much. I'm sure we'll check in with you a bit later on. Thanks for now. Right, Sarah, Wes, Paul, very welcome, very warm welcome to you here in the Election 2023 studio tonight. Let's start on that issue. We do not know at this stage if voter ID is going to be a big problem of the night. But, Sarah, I saw you nodding when Anna was saying that earlier. Have the Lib Dems heard significant evidence of this? Do you have a picture of it?
Well, it's just anecdotal, but I mean, some of the things that we've been hearing are quite concerning. I've been hearing, again, anecdotally about voters who, for example, are registered on the electoral register in their married name, but their passport that they've brought with them is in their maiden name. Obviously, a lot of women will be in that situation and haven't been allowed to vote. I'm only talking anecdotally, but one of the things that really concerns me is that I don't think the government have planned to really collect the robust data that we really need to see what kind of impact this has had. We know there's been a bit of confusion about the role of greeters, for example, outside the polling station. And if you've arrived at your polling station today and been greeted by someone and told that you don't have the appropriate ID, then the polling centre staff won't be writing down your name as somebody who's been turned away. So we won't even know, I think, after the election quite what impact that's had. And never mind, as your reporter was saying there, people who haven't even come to the polling station because they didn't have the right ID to start with.
We should emphasise, though, that we've got no idea at this point how widespread it is. But it's interesting, the Electoral Commission have put out a statement. We can show you what they've said. They've said, we already know from our research that the ID requirement posed a greater challenge for some groups in society, and that some people were regrettably unable to vote today as a result. They go on to say it'll be essential to understand the extent of the impact and the reasons behind it. Paul Scully, there was a pretty vigorous debate in Westminster about whether this was the right thing to do. Yeah. The opposition parties articulated concerns. The Electoral Commission's admitting tonight there were some people who weren't able to vote.
I think the chief exec of the electoral returning officers has said, in his view, that it's worked pretty well. It hasn't had much an effect. But we do need to see. We clearly need to see after this. I think when it was introduced by Labour government back in Northern Ireland.
In Northern Ireland, yeah, it's been up and running there for a while. Yeah.
The then Northern Ireland minister said at the time it was introduced well, and it had no effect on suppressing the vote there.
But the Electoral Commission saying already it has done some people who are unable to vote, and that's not good enough, is it?
What we've got to find out is whether those people weren't able to vote at the time or whether they went back and got their ID, as we've heard a couple of examples. But it's not good enough to use anecdotes. We've got to make sure that we can actually,
and we should be very, very
take a
clear
view
with
on this.
That we have to wait and see. But clearly the Electoral Commission are already saying on the record there has been an issue. But important to point out, we don't know how big it is. We can see some shots of the count in Bolton. It's another part of the country where people have been working hard. That's a council that has been in no overall control for the last while. From what we've seen so far, Wes Streeting, what would be your expectation of tonight?
Well, I think Labour's expecting a good night. We've run a really good campaign. We've stayed throughout on the issues that voters really care about, cutting the cost of living, cutting NHS waiting times, cutting crime. And whether it's holding the Conservatives to account for their record of failure over the last 13 years or putting across Labour's positive plan nationally, as well as all of those brilliant local campaigns, I think we can be really proud of the campaign that we've run. I hope that's reflected in the results overnight. I expect that will be reflected in the results overnight. And I think it demonstrates, actually, from where we were in 2019 when these elections were last fought, which, of course, was before we were brought to a crushing defeat in the general election, that the Labour Party, in terms of policy, in terms of organisation and in terms of leadership, is very much back in business and in a position where we can win the next general election. And beyond tonight, that will be the focus of the coming months. So I doubt the Prime Minister's going to be in a hurry to call one by the time he sees all the results come in. But whenever that election is, we'll be ready.
Well, we can see there's some Labour activists looking extremely happy in Stoke. Hugs all round already, it appears. We don't know anything about the results there yet, but people clearly happy about something. But it's interesting, though, John Curtice very clearly has laid down the gauntlet. He said you have to be looking at a double-digit lead in the projected share, which is a long way off. That's going to be sometime tomorrow afternoon. But are you confident that you'll get to that kind of
To be honest,
level?
whether it's very respected people like John Curtice or some of the absolutely shocking punditry Paul's party's been putting out in the last few hours, we know what the challenge is. We are looking at these results closer than anyone else, because what we will be judging ourselves against is, are we making progress in those communities, in those constituencies that Labour will need to win in order to form a government? That's the test we set ourselves, regardless of the test anyone else sets us.
But it's important,
and I think we
for
will
our
be seeing
viewers,
progress in those areas.
But it's important for our viewers, though, to understand what the benchmarks are. And John Curtice says the benchmark for you is a double-digit lead in the national share. Are you confident you're going to get that?
Well, we'll see as the results come in. I'm not daft enough to make predictions of what this time of night, but I think we're in for a good night, and I'm very proud of the campaign the Labour Party's run. I haven't seen a campaign like this from the Labour Party for some years, actually, and I think that will be reflected in the results that we see.
Chris.
Just one source, Laura, chipping in from Labour HQ, watching our analysis and hearing Sir John's analysis a little earlier around what was described as a very high bar of a double-digit lead, and saying that an 8-point lead would be their best result since 1997. A couple of other things just I'm hearing, Laura. Lib Dems getting very excited about Hinckley and Bosworth in the Midlands. They think there has been, or they claim there has been, a total Tory collapse, as it was described to me. The Conservatives are nervous, very nervous, about Windsor and Maidenhead in Berkshire and bits of Kent, more optimistic in the northeast of England in Darlington and Redcar, and Labour pretty chipper about Plymouth.
Now, let's test that out then with Sarah. Chris just gave a list of places where the Lib Dems sound pretty happy.
Can I add one?
Yeah, but by all means, we're here for tips and trends and your insights.
I've just heard from Sunderland. We've taken a seat off the Tories there, which makes us the official opposition now on Sunderland Council, which is fantastic news and really, really a huge tribute to Sunderland Liberal Democrats. But I mean, we're really looking forward to the results coming in. We're preparing ourselves actually for a really, really good night. We've had a brilliant campaign up and down the country. We think we're going to make real progress, real gains, and that's coming off the back of 700 seats that we won, the last time these were up. So, we're not just holding on to those fantastic gains we made, but making even more progress.
And I am going to press you on your adjectives. So a good night, what does that mean? So someone in your party said to me, well, if we get over 200, that will really be pretty good. Less than that, go on.
I'd be happy with 200. That sounds good to me. But I mean, I think the important thing for us is that we're not only making progress in some of those constituencies that we're looking to win at the next general election, but we're making progress in all sorts of places where, that aren't target seats for us. Sunderland, as I was just saying. Windsor and Maidenhead is not somewhere that we have, had much representation before, but we are hoping potentially that we might even take that. And places like Dacorum in Hertfordshire, also going really, really well. South Gloucestershire we've mentioned, East Cambridgeshire we think, all across the country, and some Labour-facing seats, although primarily we're looking at taking seats off the Tories.
And you mentioned there that challenge for the Lib Dems, you're trying to face both ways, but actually all of the big parties are doing that. You're trying to hold off the Liberal Democrats in Hull while trying to take seats off Tories in the other places, and you are fighting both the other parties on several fronts. All three of you, thank you very much for now. You're staying with us. Worth reminding, as Sarah was saying, that the last time these council seats were fought was in 2019. Now, that's not 2019 when there was a general election, when Boris Johnson stormed it and seemed to redraw the map. It was the 2019 local elections. Cast your mind back. That was a completely different political world. Theresa May was still in charge, although hanging on by her fingernails. Jeremy Corbyn was still the leader of the Labour Party. Vince Cable was still the leader of the Lib Dems. So we must remember that when we're talking about the last time these council seats were fought, it was a completely different political universe. So bear that in mind when we're thinking about things and seats changing hands around the country. Let's get out around the country now. Let's go to Reeta Chakrabarti in northwest Leicestershire. Now, currently the council there, Reeta, has got a small Conservative majority, but are those with the blue rosettes looking nervous tonight?
Oh, they very much are. I mean, this particular area, there are 38 council seats up for grabs. So it's quite a simple one to understand. That's 38 council seats. That's each ward has one councillor. And as you said, in 2019, the Conservatives just held on to a majority of 20 seats. Later, 2 Labour councillors actually defected to the Tories. But that's the picture here tonight. The Tories are very much worried that Labour are going to gain here. And interestingly enough, I turned up here and I wasn't expecting as many Tory candidates as I've seen. And I've just spoken to the district council leader, Richard Blunt, and he basically said, we're going to need some independents. So suggesting that it's going to go to no overall control. And that's what we're seeing here.
And I wonder also, there's been controversy there locally because the MP, Andrew Bridgen, who was a Conservative MP, he's recently been booted out of the party over some of the very controversial things he said. But it was, you know, I remember from covering the referendum campaign, it was a place where Boris Johnson turned up and there was huge excitement for him. It was a place where the Conservatives felt were, you know, pretty secure in terms of the result. But do you think what's happened with Andrew Bridgen, and maybe also what's happened with Boris Johnson, has had an impact on people's views there?
Well, definitely, because if we look back to 2019, when it was all about Brexit, Boris and Andrew Bridgen were very much hand in hand. He was vote leave, and many people backed him on that, and they voted to, you know, come out of Brexit in northwest Leicestershire. But that has changed now, and many people are saying, is there going to be an Andrew Bridgen effect here? Because yes, as you said, because of his comments on COVID, he basically was expelled from the Tory party, so he's now standing as an independent. I haven't seen him just yet, but it'll be interesting to see whether that's had an impact. I actually did ask some people in the ex-mining town of Colville, who it's normally a Labour stronghold. I asked, you know, has Andrew Bridgen had an effect here? And they said, you know, they don't really care about him so much. So that's quite interesting. Perhaps for local people, you know, I've also heard that he's been very much seen as a pantomime dame over the years, but he has very much supported what local people believe in, especially on issues like HS2, which he's very much opposed to, as well as most recently in Kegworth, a sleepy village town, there was an issue over asylum seekers being housed in a local hotel there, which happened overnight, and Andrew Bridgen was very much against that. So he has been at loggerheads with national government decisions over the years. So perhaps there may be some people that do support him, despite the fact that he's now defected, well, he's now been expelled from the Tory party.
Nisha, thanks so much. Interesting stuff. And a reminder, in these kinds of elections, in any election, there's always contributions from both the local and the national going on in voters' brains. Let's go to another part of the country, not that far from where Nisha was. Let's talk to our political editor in the Midlands, Lizzie Glinka. Now, you are in Stoke, in Staffordshire. As you said a bit earlier, that's the kind of part of the country where, you know, people innocently going about their business might be challenged by a political leader at almost any time of day or night during an election because they fight very bitterly over it. What's your sense of the way it's going to go tonight?
Yeah, absolutely, Laura. You could meet a front bencher on any corner in Stoke-on-Trent over the last few weeks. This is a very hotly contested election here in the Potteries. So Labour lost this council back in 2015. That was kind of the beginning of a downward spiral for Labour in this part of the world. In 2019, this council went to no overall control. The same year that all 3 of the MPs in the city, which had been Labour, went Conservative. And the Conservatives are the largest party on the council, so they've been running it for the last 4 years. Now, Labour have thrown resources here over the last few weeks. Lots of campaigning. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, launched his crime platform here in the city, no coincidence, and a big focus because they would love to take back control here. However, I don't know if they're going to have it all their own way. There's an added complication here in the Potteries of quite a number of very well-known, embedded in the community independents, which will make it more difficult for them. And also we think that turnout, we are hearing that we think turnout is going to be quite low here in the city. So that may make things difficult for Labour as well. However, very early days, but as you saw, there was some celebrating going on here in Stoke earlier. That was a Labour hold. And we are hearing from Conservative sources that they think they they've lost one of their seats to Labour. They think they've lost Abby Holton. We don't know that yet for certain, but it is Conservative sources who are telling us that. So very early days here, but it's definitely one to watch.
And Lizzie, when we think more broadly about that part of the country, I mean, we're showing viewers some of the councils in that part of the world. You've got Dudley, Redditch, Worcester. Now, these are important, of course, for local reasons, but it's a bit like a roll call also of those kinds of places that will be vital marginal seats when it comes to a general election, and lots of places where Labour lost out at the last time round.
Yeah.
What's your sense of the wider balance of support there at the moment?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, traditionally, you would always think of the Midlands as the bellwether in England for elections anyway. I think that's perhaps even more so the case now because as well as the traditional bellwethers, places like Worcester or Stafford, we have got these areas that formerly referred to as the Red Wall in Stoke-on-Trent and the Black Country, where Labour have to get back. They've got to show progress here if they've got any hope of forming the next government after the next general election. Now, I think the sense on the ground is that people are a little bit trepidatious. We've got those national polling figures that show Labour far ahead, but in some of these communities, we're still trying to sense whether the changes that happened over the last 5 or 6 years, that big shift we saw in 2019, whether for some people that is a permanent shift on issues like immigration. Do some of the people who voted for the Conservatives for the first time in 2019, do they now feel more at home with the Conservative Party than with the Labour Party, who they may have voted for, you know, previously for the rest of their lives? So that is a kind of interesting thing that we're sort of watching here in the Midlands to see whether that is borne out in these local council elections. I think in places like Dudley and Walsall that you mentioned, Labour are hoping to make gains there, but because the councils are only up by thirds, we're less likely to see perhaps Labour taking control of those councils. However, if they do have a storming night and do brilliantly well, there is a chance they could take back control in somewhere like Walsall.
Lizzie, thank you very much indeed for that. Amazing how the phrase take back control is something used by all the political parties now, become part of the political lexicon, hasn't it? But we all remember where it came from in the beginning. We do have some more results that have come through. Let's just take a skip through some of the latest ones. Newcastle Council has been held by Labour, South Tyneside 2, Halton 2, in Cheshire on the Liverpool side. None of them are really a surprise. Broxbourne held by the Conservatives and Labour holding Chorley and Sunderland. So some of the latest results of councils holds there. As Lizzie was saying, a reminder that in lots of parts of the country, only a third of the council seats are up for grabs, which means that we might not be seeing many councils themselves actually change hands. It might be more a change here and a change there in the numbers of seats, but we'll be trying to make that clear for you all as the night goes on. I want to show you Brentwood in Essex. The count is going on there. And the reason for telling you that is there's an interesting result there. Now, Brentwood is somewhere where the Conservatives have been pretty secure, but there are some changes already. The Lib Dems have gained a seat from the Tories in Hutton East Ward there. And the interesting thing about it is they've taken it on a 24% swing. In a second ward there, same part of the world in Essex and Brentwood, the Lib Dems have held another seat, but even in that seat they already had, they've had a 14% swing. So those are pretty big numbers when it comes to elections. Only very early whispers in the wind, Chris. But what do you make of what we've seen so far?
They're kind of loud whispers, if such a thing is possible, aren't they, when you look at those numbers? And quite strikingly, Alex Burgart, the Conservative MP in Brentwood, saying at the count that he fears the results could be worse than expected for the Conservatives, possibly losing their majority there. One of the little nuggets to bring you from the southwest of England in Plymouth, senior Conservatives there predicting something approaching a wipeout and a big majority for Labour. You might recall there's been a row there about trees, the future of trees in the city, hugely contentious local issue. May or may not have, informed voters' minds as they headed to the polling stations, but it's significant movement there, it would appear. That's
interesting. And Plymouth, of course, important to both parties when it comes to a general election, out with those local things, because at the moment, Labour represented there, so are the Conservatives, and it's definitely somewhere on Labour's target list. We're going to talk to Reeta just in a second about projected national share. Now, John Curtice introduced that concept to us.
Yes.
The numbers for the next 18 hours or go into a giant calculator, and sometime tomorrow afternoon we'll come up with a projection of what would have happened today if the whole country had been voting, what that would mean for the share of the parties. How much do the party headquarters look at that?
Big time. Absolutely, they look at it. Because, of course, there's all of the individual results that we'll unpick through the small hours and throughout tomorrow, which will matter on a local level for all the obvious reasons. But once all of those numbers are thrown into Sir John's brain and computer, and all of the psephologists pour over it and churn out that number, that is what gives that broader sense of how things might have been today, tonight, tomorrow, had it been a general election. Clearly, it isn't a general election. People are motivated to vote for lots of different reasons, and the geography is different. But the projected national share attempts to take account of that and then come up with a number which is a massive mood maker for the parties and gives them a sense of, well, firstly, whether their own intelligence turned out to be right. And then secondly, is their campaigning, their techniques, their ground operation, their local media officers, their digital approach, are they working or not? Are they focusing on the right areas? Are they putting their resources into the areas where they can maximise the benefit? So hugely important intelligence for them in the year, 18 months or whatever it turns out to be between now and the general election.
And who knows what will have happened by then, but it will be a statistic that people will look at carefully. Now, Reeta, give us the history of this statistic that people obsess over so much.
Here it is in graphic form, going back 2 decades. Projected national share, as Laura has described, is our extrapolation of what would have happened if the whole country had voted in local elections in any one year. And you can see that last year, 2022, Labour was on 35%, the Conservatives on 30%, the Lib Dems on 19%, and others on 16%. But actually, what we want to compare with are the elections that took place in 2019, because the vast majority of the seats that are up tonight were voted on in 2019. And there you can see that both Labour and the Conservatives had a poor night of it, a very poor night, neither of them getting more than 30% of the share of the vote. And the others, who include the Greens and the Independents, actually had a much better performance that time. So we'll be looking to see whether both parties do better than they did in 2019, and particularly with Labour, given their big lead in the opinion polls. We're going to want to see how far ahead of the Conservatives, should this be what happens, how far ahead they are, because it is the gap between the two that is so important. Is it the double-digit lead that some people are talking about? Is it 8%? We'll be in a position to know that in a few hours' time. It's important, the lead, because if you go back to the high point on this graph for Labour, that was in 2012, where they had a 7-point lead over the Conservatives. But as we all know, Ed Miliband did not become Prime Minister. 7 percentage points at that point was not enough to get him eventually into Downing Street. A word too about the Liberal Democrats' performance over time. So 19% last year. The Liberal Democrats usually do well in terms of the share of the vote in local elections, but 19% compared to what they were getting in 2004, 2005, where at one point they overtook the Labour Party. Well, you can see, if you follow the yellow line down, the plummeting in Lib Dem support that happened after they went into government with the Conservatives. So lots of food for thought there. Laura.
Thank you very much, Reeta. Well, that is the big historical picture. And what we're doing in the next few hours is looking at lots of individual little jigsaw pieces as they emerge. One of them's just popped up there. We were just talking about Brentwood in Essex. There's been another Lib Dem gain there, which does mean that the Conservative majority is likely to go, not confirmed, but as Chris was suggesting a moment ago, another little jigsaw piece seems to have just made that more likely, and the local MP has been tweeting about that. Also want to bring you the first news of the Greens. The first Green seat has been won. They've gained the West Park ward from Labour in South Tyneside, so up in the northeast of England. the first Green gain of the night. And there may well be, the Green Party has said on the record, they hope to take about another 100 seats in these local council elections. They've got hopes also of taking the first majority council, which would be making history for them. So we'll be keeping a close eye on what's happening to the Green Party, and we'll be talking to them, of course, through the course of the night. Right. Let's get a bit of perspective about what might be going on inside the political parties as they're watching nervously in their headquarters. Maybe people could say things privately to each other. Let's talk to Sonia Soda, who's the chief leader writer at the Observer newspaper, and also Harry Cole, the political editor of The Sun. Welcome to you both. Good to have you with us. Harry, so far, what are you hearing from Tory HQ?
Actually, they've got a bit quiet, I have to say. There was an initial flurry of activity about 10 o'clock where they were saying that Labour needed to gain thousands and thousands of seats to be on course for number 10. But I think most interestingly was what Rishi Sunak said publicly last night. He was out about on the Tory sort of party circuit last night, and he said this was going to be a very, very tough evening for the Conservative Party. And so far, we've seen very little to disprove that. I think he's probably right. Those results from Sunderland, which were the only release of data we have so far, UKIP were at a very high point at the nadir of Theresa May's administration in May 2019 when those seats were last fought, and UKIP did very well. That UKIP vote seems to be splitting for Labour, and that will be a very, very bad sign for the Tories.
I can see, Harry, I can't resist mentioning the poster behind your head that says loose lips sink ships. I just wonder if the Tory losses add up to as much as people in Party HQ have been suggesting they might, with the 1,000 seats that we've had a dollop of salt poured all over it in the last few days by experts like John Curtice. But the Tory chatter, if this is a bad night, from your assessment of the sort of current state of the party, could Rishi Sunak actually end up in trouble if they are, 800, 900 seats down?
I don't think so. Frankly, the Tories had a fairly hectic year of changing their leader last year. I think they'd lose any shred of credibility if they were even to begin to try to move against another leader this side of an election. I just can't see it happening. That's not to say there's not going to be a lot of grumbling about the direction of travel, perhaps the ambition of Rishi Sunak sticking to those 5 pledges that he's hammering and hammering again. Some MPs will want to hear more from him about his vision, about his leadership and how he's going to win the next election, how he's going to turn it around. But frankly, I think that the Tories have made their bed now. It's very, very hard for them to even begin to contemplate a massive change of direction. Rishi Sunak has been beginning to edge ahead in some of those opinion polls nationally. He's closed the gap. He's nudging ahead as the best leader. But tonight, it looks like so far, and obviously it's very early days, there's very little so far in the first hours or so of these results for Tories to cling to. And it's going to be a rough year for them. I mean, an election is basically 14 months away. And on these results, it doesn't look great.
Sonia, when we think about the Lib Dems, they've, traditionally local government is where they build back. It's where they have their foot soldiers. It's where they fight often very successful, sometimes quite testy campaigns. Do you think that they might end up actually by tomorrow afternoon being the ones who feel massively chipper?
Well, it's, obviously we haven't had enough results in so far, but the couple that we have had are looking quite good, it has to be said, for the Lib Dems. I think the real test for the Lib Dems in these local elections is, can they build on where they were in 2019? The really key places to look for will be where they're competitive against the Conservatives. And that will be a real sign, I think, of whether we might see a bit of a comeback from them in the next general election when it comes to parliamentary seats. I think they did better than many were expecting when these seats were last contested in 2019. We've seen some quite positive by-election results for them as well in the last couple of years. And it does feel like, the Lib Dems really did hitch themselves to Brexit and sort of being on the Remain side of the equation in recent years. And there's no question that that harmed them somewhat. But now it feels like if you look at seats where they're against the Conservatives, it does feel like they've always done best on local issues, and it does look like those are what are coming to the fore again in those seats where they are competitive against the Conservatives.
And just let's think for a second about this campaign in the last few weeks. We're just showing some people some of the latest results as they've come in. Actually, interesting that the Conservatives have held Harlow, and Labour were hopeful of making gains there, but the Tories have held on to it. We'll see later whether seats have changed hands or not. Some other results coming there. Some we've already mentioned, Chorley and Sunderland being held by Labour, Broxbourne and Hertfordshire being held by the Tories. But in the last few weeks in this campaign, what has stood out to you?
Do you mean sort of from the Labour perspective? I mean, I think it is really actually, if you look at the polling and the fact that in recent weeks, the gap has closed a little bit, but Labour have been, so far ahead in a way that I think lots of people just simply wouldn't have predicted given the general election result in 2019 under Boris Johnson. I mean, obviously, so much has happened since then. So to me, that has been the kind of real standout of our politics over the last few weeks. But these set of elections, of course, are Keir Starmer's big test. It's one thing when people say in an opinion poll, oh yeah, if there were a general election tomorrow, I'd vote Labour, but will they actually turn out and vote? Local elections aren't a perfect predictor of that, but they are in some ways a more reliable predictor, many people think, than opinion polls. So I think the real question is, Labour's lead that we've been seeing in the polls, is that going to stand up in the set of results that we see from today?
Sonia, Soda and Harry Cole, thank you very much indeed for joining us at this late hour. As Sonia was saying now, these are the magic moments elections when everybody's vote, your votes, go into the ballot box and the politicians can only wait and see what you've told them. We can see votes being counted in Bolton, critical part of the country when it comes to the Labour Conservative one-on-one fight. Ipswich will be there a bit later on. In Suffolk, all sorts of interesting things happening in that part of the country. We mentioned earlier the Greens hoping to take the first council as a majority in mid-Suffolk, and also busy bees in Leicestershire. Although maybe some nervous faces. I'm trying to see if there's a rosette on that person chatting there. Oh, it looks like a green rosette. Anyway, people waiting nervously to see what happens as the results start streaming in. Let's go to somewhere where we've already told you about. There is an interesting fight going on, quite an exciting one that could be pretty tight. Let's go to Plymouth in the southwest and our political editor there, Martin. Now, we've already heard, Martin, it's tight there. It's been a tough fight between Labour and the Conservatives. Local controversies, yes, but what do you think this is going to end up as being? What are people telling you right now?
Well, we're in quite a remarkable situation where not a single seat has been declared, but I've spoken to a host of senior figures from both the Labour and Conservative camps, and there seems to be a consensus that Labour are heading for a very significant majority, and as one senior Conservative told me, they are facing wipeout. Now, it is the case that uniquely in the southwest, Plymouth is pretty much a straight fight between the two parties. It does seesaw between them. It is to some extent a barometer of the national political mood. But on top of that, as you say, there have been some extraordinary local circumstances. So that decision on the eve of the election campaign by the then Conservative leader, since resigned, to remove all of those trees in the city centre. But that was just the latest act, if you like, in an unfolding performance of Tory discord and chaos here in Plymouth. So we had a lot of Tory councillors leaving the group to become independents, and in fact this is the second year in succession, because Plymouth elects in thirds, where the Tories have gone into an election campaign having just lost their leader. So last year the leader was toppled in a vote of no confidence. This year he resigned. So you can't imagine really circumstances in which a party was in more disarray going into an election.
Interesting though, Martin, you used the word wipeout there. I mean, that sounds like it could be something very embarrassing for the Conservative Party.
Indeed, and one detail, and I say the caveat here is not a single seat has been declared. Hearing from Labour sources that they've done extremely well in the area of the city which is represented by the Veterans Minister and Plymouth Moorview MP Johnny Mercer. And of course, inevitably, with these elections potentially being the penultimate test of the electorate before a general election, there will be a great deal of interest in whether these kind of results can be carried across onto a potential general election result.
Really interesting, and of course the wider regional implications as well are interesting. One contact just suggested to me there's a massive worry in the Tory party about the south and southwest in general, so we'll see if that picture is borne out. Chris, you've just got something to chip in there.
It's a nugget picking up on just the conversation you've had and just what you were saying there, Laura, which is the Conservatives in Bath and North East Somerset very nervous. Now, we should say this was one of the Lib Dems' best performances back in 2019 when they flipped the council from the Conservatives, but the Conservatives locally there very nervous about how they are going to fare.
OK, well, we've talked a little bit about Brentwood in Essex. Let's take you there and check in with Harry Farley, who's there for us tonight. Now, Harry, can you describe what you're hearing on the ground? We've already talked about it, an interesting picture developing.
Yes, very interesting, Laura. This is one of those seats that in the general election, the Conservatives have quite a strong majority, but in the locals here tonight, the Lib Dems are doing very well and they are pushing them hard. The Conservatives have a wafer-thin majority on Brentwood Borough Council of just 3, and Lib Dems have already tonight made 2 gains off the Conservatives. So they are pushing the Conservatives hard. They're trying to take the Conservatives' majority off them, take it to no overall control, and I'm even hearing some very optimistic whispers from some Lib Dems tonight who think they might be able to gain a majority when the next set of seats come up next year. So it's a very interesting picture here in Brentwood. The Conservatives, I have to say, looking very nervous, and the local MP Alex Burkhardt said to me earlier he thinks that the results are going to be worse than he fears.
And Harry, we're just going to show people the change in the vote share there in Brentwood, because it's very clear when you see it. The Liberal Democrats up 3%, Labour up 4%, the Conservatives down 6%. Now, they're still counting votes. This is not the final picture. But why do you think that has happened from people you've spoken to in that part of the world?
Well, we talk about whether people vote over national issues or local issues. In this part of the world, it's a greenbelt area on the edges of London, just outside the M25. Housing is a key issue, I'm told, from people across the different parties here. 2 new developments in Brentwood in the last few years approved by the Tory majority on the council, and that's made a number of people, a number of voters in particular, particularly concerned about that. They don't like the new developments in their local area, and the Lib Dems have been campaigning hard against that new development, and so housing a key issue in this part of the world in particular.
Harry, thanks very much. We'll come back to you, I think, a bit later on. Thank you for now. Paul Scully, you've been the Minister for London. You've done lots of different jobs in the government, but we've heard a few times already tonight how much discontent there seems to be bubbling up, and particularly an issue of housing and for people in the South East. Are you worried about what you're hearing, concerned?
Well, look, I think we know. We've known this is going to be a bad night for us, absolutely, a bad night for us, because we are mid-term. It's a difficult set of elections for us. Professors Rallings and Thrasher and I think John Curtice at one point were talking about losses of 1,000 for us.
No, the consensus for most election experts is that that's very much at the worst end of expectation. And the people who came up with that figure have been clear since then. That's at the worst end of expectation.
But nonetheless, that's still their figures. And so, there's lots of good councillors going to be losing their seats tonight.
Could you lose 1,000 seats?
We've already heard. Well, let's see. I mean, it's very, very early days. There's lots of good councillors going to be losing their seats. We've heard from Wales when they talk about the NHS and all the other things like that. Actually, none of that is going to change as a result of this election. There's going to be lots of good councillors running good public services that are going to lose their seats. And I say that as an ex-councillor myself, and having lost my seat on the same day as the general election, then you tend to find that constituents often get buyer's regret 3.5 years into it when realising what happened. But in terms of housing, there's a really difficult balance to be struck here, because everybody, this isn't about what happens within one party, a political party, or even across the parties. It's actually communities, because everybody wants more houses that don't necessarily want them next to them.
And you have had 13 years to try to come up with something that people would be happy with.
How do you square that circle? We've actually built more houses last year than I think the third highest house building over the last year, over the last 30 years. So we're doing our best to try and build supply. But it is an incredibly difficult dynamic to get right.
But if you do lose that 1,000 seats, which I know you're still sticking to that as a possibility.
Yeah.
You still think that could happen?
It's a possibility. I mean, let's see what's happening, because as I say, if nonetheless, we are in midterms, and Rishi Sunak has come in with his 5 points plan of halving inflation, growing the economy, reducing the debt, cutting the backlog in the NHS, and stopping the budget.
But if you'd lose 1,000,
but we're only a quarter of the way through the year.
But if you'd lose 1,000 seats, and Theresa May, when she was fighting these seats, lost 1,300. So if you lose 1,000 seats, then whatever Rishi Sunak's saying, whether he's got a 5-point plan, a 20-point plan, or a 1,000-point plan, people aren't going for it.
No, what I'm saying is that plan has specific outcomes that can be measured. We're a quarter of the way through, if even that, of him being able to deliver that. So it's really early doors for him doing that. We've seen the polls start to close, the national polls start to close, but as Chris was saying earlier on, these are far more measurable when you get the results tomorrow. But nonetheless, the fact is that people are seeing Rishi. They like what they see over the whole, but it's very much job unfinished yet. We've got to go through that process.
Well, Wes, you're making faces, so let's see what's on your mind.
I find this totally implausible. On one hand, Paul Scully's saying, poor local Conservative councillors being punished for national issues, and then in the next breath he's saying the voters like Rishi Sunak. I mean, let's remember that Theresa May had to apologise to Conservative councillors who lost their seats in that terrible election in 2019 when we were told that the Conservatives had hit rock bottom. And now they're plumbing new depths. And I'm not sure whether when the Conservative Party chairman said we're expecting to lose 1,000 seats, whether that was an expectation or an ambition, because they have done precisely nothing to speak to the voters' concerns during the course of this election.
Not.
They tried to pretend the elections weren't happening at one point. Remember, Rishi Sunak launched his campaign but didn't tell anyone about it because he was so confident about delivering against his priorities.
These are local elections, Wes. These are local elections.
They are, but you've acknowledged that Conservative councillors are losing their seats because of your government's record.
No,
and we're not in the midterm, we're at the end game. You've been in for 13 years and 4 years into this
without any
Parliament.
concrete plan. You've been waving a finger, talking about national issues, not talking about local issues. And these are council elections about local issues. There are some factors. You talked about Plymouth being a really good example of where there's some local factors at play. But actually, people are going to be really... you're leading people up a garden path if you think that what you were talking about earlier on about the NHS is going to change tomorrow.
No, it needs to change at a general election. I'm glad you've acknowledged that as well,
because they've changed the councillor. But it doesn't set anything in train that you are expecting people to be waking up tomorrow and thinking, oh, thank goodness, I haven't got a Conservative councillor, therefore we're on train to changing the NHS. There is no link. Either you believe in devolution, and therefore, when you allow councillors to be accountable for their decisions, otherwise, or you start muddying the water, as you have been doing throughout this campaign. I'm sitting there, you rightly said I'm Minister for London. I've had 3 years of watching Sadiq Khan waving a finger at absolutely everybody. I mean, there are no elections in London, let's be clear, today. And absolutely wagging a finger at everyone rather than delivering himself. It's a really good hiding place for politicians when you muddy the waters.
I've never seen anything like this on an election night where the Conservatives come on and basically complain that their opponents ran a better campaign on the issues that matter to voters, and then say, oh no, we've lost these seats because they ran a better campaign.
I'm saying you're talking about...
That's no consolation to Conservative councillors, is it?
About a better campaign. I'm actually saying that you're dealing with the wrong campaign because you're dealing with the issues that are not actually...
Well, I'm not sure the numbers will say that by the end of the night. That we ran the wrong campaign.
You're not dealing with the issues that actually those councillors...
Cost of living, NHS crime, these are the issues the voters are raising. These are the issues the voters are raising. We're speaking to those issues.
There is a point, though, here, though, isn't there? You ran a campaign absolutely voting or asking people to vote on things that are not directly in council control. Every day we heard Keir Starmer talking about the cost of living. Now, most of the decisions that are made relating to that are made by national government. He was talking about the NHS, he was talking about crime. Now, most of those things, not all, local councils, of course, have influence in all sorts of ways. But there's no doubt that you ran a nationally focused campaign.
Well,
is that fair in these kinds of elections?
Well, I'd say two things. Firstly, local government does have an impact on cost of living and on the NHS and in terms of crime and has powers they can use. And of course, nationally, we've been speaking to voters right across England with national messages on the voters' priorities. But ask Tudor Evans down in Plymouth whether or not we've been running a national election rather than fighting on local issues. Of course, in local communities, Labour councillors, Labour candidates, Labour group leaders have been running very effective, I think we'll see, local campaigns. But of course, Keir Starmer, as the person who wants to be our next Prime Minister, is talking directly to voters about the issues that matter to them, that they care about, and giving people a sense of Labour's direction so they can anticipate not just what Labour will deliver in local government, should we win councils tonight, but what we'll deliver after the next general election. We're not mid-term, this is endgame. A confident government calls an election after 4 years, we're going to be going right to the tail end of this government.
And yet you find that actually, when you get poll after poll, it's you know, Rishi is around the area when he's seen as the best leader.
Okay.
Well, that's not consolation to people losing their seats.
We're going to leave it there with you two for now. Thank you for your contributions. You're not going to agree, but you're doing it in good spirit. Sarah, you were looking at your phone. Now, what is going on? What are you hearing?
Well, no, I'm looking at the Cotswolds. We're doing really, really well in the Cotswolds. We're seeing some really good results coming in there. And actually, and the excellent results we've also had from Brentwood really reflect the sorts of things I've been hearing on the doorstep, that so many voters have been saying to me, you know, they just can't vote for the Tories anymore. And that, I think, is really being reflected in results coming in from all over the country tonight. I didn't expect it to be quite, you know, that large swing you were talking about in Brentwood earlier. I wish we could see the projected national vote share just on that ward.
What, stop the clock now at 16 minutes to 1, that's it. The projected national share based on one ward.
It really does reflect.
Swing to the Lib Dems.
It really does reflect everything I've been hearing. People are fed up with the Conservatives. They feel taken for granted. They feel, you know, and a lot of the people I've been talking to, I've been mostly out in places in Surrey, like Surrey Heath and Guildford and Elmbridge, their mortgages are going up by so much because of the Tory chaos that we saw last autumn, and people are still feeling that and will continue to feel it. Their taxes are going up, prices at the tills are going up, and the Tories are doing nothing about it. And I hear what Paul is saying, and this is a, you know, it's a mixture of local and national, but voters will make their own decision about why they make that choice, and they have been sending a very, very clear message.
As they have in Bacton in North Norfolk, where we've just won a seat off the Lib Dems. So, I mean, you know, obviously, you mean in Surrey, you should go to North Norfolk and see what's going on with Duncan Baker and his colleagues. Both marvellous
parts of the country.
Absolutely.
We like everywhere here in this studio. There's going to be more vigorous conversation shortly, and we should just remind everybody it is still early, but we do have results coming in. Let's look at our big tower tally. Labour on 64 seats so far. They've gained 2. Liberal Democrats on 25, gaining 6. That's why Sarah's so chipper. The Tories on 23, losing 9. The Greens there taking 2. Independents and other smaller parties gaining 1 on 8. And RA, that's an important acronym. We have it on local election nights. Residents' associations, who are a really strong and powerful factor in some parts of the country. Now, all three of the politicians were tangling there over what we can read in so far, but I bet they and you and me probably all want to hear what Sir John Curtice thinks we can read into what we are hearing so far. John, you've been looking at some of the key wards, the places that we select as good measures to put into your giant calculations to give us a flavour of what it might mean. What are you seeing so far?
Well, let's remind viewers, we are collecting the detailed ward-by-ward results in 45 councils that elected yesterday, and we've now got the results from over 50 of the individual wards within those councils. So it's still relatively early doors, but a pattern is beginning to emerge. First of all, let's look at the change since 2019, which is when the seats up for grabs on Thursday were for the most part contested. Now, let me give Mr. Scully a little bit of good news. The Conservative share of the vote in these wards is so far up. But of course, what we have to remember about the May 2019 local elections is that both Conservative and Labour did very badly. So it wasn't exactly terribly difficult for both of them to register something about. So of course, the crucial thing is what's the difference between the two? Well, if you take the 9 up for Labour and the 1 up from the Conservatives, we're essentially talking about a 4% swing so far from Conservative to Labour, which perhaps is a little bit less than what we might expect from the national opinion polls, but certainly is going to be enough to result in quite a lot of Conservative losses during the course of tomorrow.
So, John, I just want to take people through those numbers again. You've mentioned them and we're showing them on the screen. So the change since 2019, when these seats were last fought, which was Theresa May, Jeremy Corbyn, Vince Cable, end of that era. Labour up 9% since 2019. Tories up 1% since 19. Lib Dems up 2%. I can show people also the change since 2022, because that's one of our other benchmarks, isn't it? Labour only up so far 1% from those key wards you've explained. Tories down 5% and the Lib Dems up 2%. So just to show people the numbers as you are talking through them.
Yeah, so again, if we take the difference between the Labour and the Conservative figure, we're talking about a 3% swing from Conservative to Labour as compared with last year. So on both measures, we're not seeing a dramatic swing to Labour. And, you know, you will notice the Labour vote is only just up on last year, but we're certainly seeing quite considerable progress by the Labour Party. I think we might, however, also note that the Liberal Democrats are indeed up by a couple of points on both these measures. Now, both last year and in 2019 are pretty much equally the best performance by the Liberal Democrats so far, and since they entered into coalition with the Conservatives in 2010. So we might be looking at the best Liberal Democrat performance in local elections since then, although still not back to the level that they were getting before 2010. But that said, before Sarah Olney gets too ecstatic about the results she's saying for, if I were to tell you that I've also seen 1 or 2 results in Brentwood where actually there was a swing from the Democrats to the Conservatives. The truth is, one of the things we do have to remember about local elections is that local factors do sometimes make a difference. And therefore, as a result, we never, ever make too much of results in individual wards. But certainly, I mean, that said, Liberal Democrats made a progress. The other thing, perhaps less obvious, the Greens probably, if you actually look at the places where the Greens have fought this time and also fought last time, they're probably not doing as well as they did in 2019. But that, of course, was their best set of local elections ever.
John, thank you so much for taking us through all of that. I think Sarah and Paul Scully are both, you know, Paul, you crack a little smile, and Sarah, you did, you know, take a breath. I want to bring in Chris, our political editor. It's early, we know that, but some pretty interesting things starting to emerge from what John was saying there.
Yeah, it's 10 to 1 in the morning, wholesome ward-by-ward declaration, followed by Olympian extrapolation. feels like kind of good for the soul in its own way, doesn't it? And keeping us all going through the small hours. Just bringing a couple of other little nuggets whilst you were chatting there. Conservatives feeling pretty pessimistic in Bolton. They are repeating their pessimism from Windsor and Maidenhead in Berkshire. But yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? As we begin to see at this very, very early stage about what gap, if any, there is between where Labour have been in the opinion polls and the Conservatives have been over the last 6-7 months and where we might get to when we start crunching through all of these results by the tail end of tomorrow afternoon and tomorrow tea time. Those beginnings of straws in the wind, particularly, as John was saying, in those key wards, which are looked at particularly because they account for how the rest of the country might be reflecting on things, including those parts that obviously weren't voting, as is now yesterday. And
sentiment is so important, isn't it? So we can see, we're starting to see pictures of happy Labour faces looking in Ipswich.
Measuring smiles.
Measuring smiles. People in Leicestershire, people in Stoke, people around the country. Now this could completely change by 2 a.m, which is why this is exciting. It could completely change again by 6 a.m. tomorrow, and it could certainly all change by 6 p.m. tomorrow evening, absolutely. But the sentiment of all of this is such a sort of valuable commodity, isn't it?
Yeah, because sentiment builds energy, or the lack of it. It builds enthusiasm, or the lack of it, amongst the grassroots of political parties, who are the door knockers and the envelope stuffers and the backbone of the campaigning enterprise of a party, the voluntary party that give up their weekends and their Wednesday nights to go out and campaign for their party. And when you get a set of results like this and all of the analysis that comes afterwards, that will enthuse or otherwise those activists, depending on how a party does. Now, obviously, that breaks down locally and regionally as well as nationally, but it's so important in kind of setting that sense of how a party thinks it's going to do. And, you know, and for those who might be marginal in their enthusiasm for their particular political party, might tempt them to think, you know what, I'm going to get stuck in for the next year, or, oh, you know, sod it, I'll go and play a round of golf instead. You know, so there's that kind of that sentiment
really
and enthusiasm. So important. Just having a quick scroll to see if there's anything else I can bring you, but actually no, it's going to take a paragraph or two to read, so I'll have a read of it.
Conservatives have just held Redditch in the Midlands, which is just worth noting.
Interesting marginal seat at the Westminster context.
Interesting marginal seat, absolutely, no doubt about that. Lib Dem's getting very excited about the Cotswold results, but somewhere they would have expected to do well. We could show you some pictures of what's happening in Scunthorpe. Now, that is a part of the country where there has traditionally been quite a tussle over things. Tories very keen to hang on. But we were hearing, as Chris was just saying there, in Bolton, worries there from the Conservatives. Let's take you straight to our colleague Kevin Fitzpatrick, who's in Bolton for us tonight. Now, Kevin, Bolton's not currently held by anyone, but there's still been quite a tussle. What's happened?
Yeah, so far, just talking to the parties here, and you're right, the Conservatives are feeling pretty pessimistic about how this might unfold. The optimists among the Labour Party are hoping they could potentially become the largest party, because there has been no overall majority here since 2019, when a long-serving Labour council was pushed out. Since then, the Conservatives have led a minority administration, a cobbled-together coalition of smaller independent parties alongside the Lib Dems as well here, and odds are that that's going to remain the case after tonight. But it does sound like the Conservatives could be a few seats down. The Labour Party are 6 behind them at the moment, so potentially they could come up behind them. But because it's an all-out election here, there are 60 council seats up for grabs, and what that means is that, talking to some of the parties in some of the wards, they're saying, depending how it goes, the Conservatives think they could hold on to all 3, or they could lose all 3. So there's quite a bit of jeopardy in how swings, very local swings, could go here and there for or against the bigger parties. And a key feature of Bolton over the last 5 or 6 years has been the growth of these hyper-local independent parties, mainly on the outskirts of the bulk of the town centre, in communities where they feel the larger parties, Labour, over the years haven't really paid them much attention, and these hyper-local parties, Falmouth and Kersley first, Horwich and Blackrod first independents, have sprung up saying, listen, we're the local people, we'll represent you properly. There's no fewer than 6 of them have councillors on Bolton Council now, 11 councillors between them, and over the last couple of years they've increasingly become influential and the kingmakers. The independents also hoping to pick up a couple more seats today. So at the end of this election, it could be the Conservatives still in power, potentially the independents more influential, but also Labour potentially with a bit of a comeback when you compare it with just a couple of years ago.
Kevin, thanks so much. Lots and lots of jeopardy there, as you say. So we'll check in later with what's happening in Bolton. I know it's somewhere that the big parties are watching very, very carefully. Reeta, we have the opportunity to delve into some of the detail, into some of the results we've had in.
You've just said that Redditch is a Conservative hold, Laura, and let's take a look now at some of the figures behind that bold result. So yes, Conservative hold, there is Redditch in the Midlands there, you can see it flashing. Let's take a look at what actually happened though. The Conservatives got 15 seats and Labour 8. And this is the Conservatives lost 2 seats, Labour gained them. Labour gained 3 seats from the Conservatives last year. But what's really interesting here is the change in the share of the vote compared to 4 years ago. And look at that. How dramatic is that? A collapse in the independence vote, and UKIP will have been a large part of that. And that has just translated back to Labour. Labour up by 16 percentage points. So does this presage a recovery for Labour in areas, swingy areas like that in the West Midlands? We'll watch and see whether that's replicated in other similar councils in that area. I want to show you Brentwood as well. We've been hearing a lot about Brentwood, a really tight race going on there. Brentwood in Essex, you can see it flashing over there on the little map. The winning post is 19 seats. There are still 3 to declare. The Conservatives on 17, the Lib Dems on 15. Let's do the same and look at the change in the seats. So the Conservatives have lost 2, the Lib Dems have picked those up. And what's happened to the share of the vote here? Also fascinating, isn't it? Conservatives down by 5 percentage points and Labour up by 5. The Lib Dems actually a more modest increase, but still 3 seats to play for. So we'll be watching that one very closely. Laura.
Reeta, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's talk to a couple of people who've got pretty good knowledge of what will be going through the politicians' minds. Let's talk to Ayesha Hazarika, now columnist, broadcaster, who worked for Ed Miliband for a long time, wrote his jokes, but also did do a lot of his political strategy. And Mo Hussein, Conservative advisor, who worked for Amber Rudd, among other people, during his time serving in government. Mo, firstly to you, are you surprised by what seems at this early stage to be looking pretty grim? Paul Scully certainly looked pretty downcast with some of the last half hour.
I'm not surprised, no. I think it was clear it was going to be a very difficult night for the government and for the Conservative Party, even though there has been the usual expectation management and lots of numbers being bandied around. I think the reality is people were bracing themselves for apathy on the doorstep, for 13 years in government, and also for issues that people are really facing and finding challenging right now that the government under this Prime Minister is trying to resolve, but it's clearly has got much more progress to make on that. So no, I'm not surprised at all.
Ayesha, in terms of what Labour is seeing so far, do you think that they will be, and I know it is early, before we say, we should say it again and again, but from what you've seen so far, does this match Labour expectation?
I think Labour is going to be pretty pleased with how tonight goes, with all the caveats that you've just set out. For a number of reasons, I think they will probably feel quite vindicated about their sort of broader political strategy paying off in some of those red wall seats. It was very interesting seeing in Jonathan Gullis's seat that big swing to Labour. And also another thing which I think they will be pleased about, it's interesting seeing how some of those smaller parties are doing. The Reform Party, for example, and again, it is early in the night, but it's interesting that like that former UKIP vote seems to be swinging behind Labour rather than swinging to the Conservative Party. So I think, as early as the night is, there will be some, good green shoots for Labour. Certainly people I've been speaking to, they're feeling quite cautiously optimistic. But I think they are also happy that they have run this as quite a brutal, ruthless kind of pitch rolling ahead of the general election. I've heard a couple of commentators make the point, oh, well, Labour, didn't just go on local issues, they were going on national issues. Elections are elections, and it is about the air war, and it is about that messaging which taps into the concerns of people, which right now are things like mortgages, the state of the NHS, crime, the general broken Britain narrative. So I think the fact that people are attacking Labour for sort of running quite a good campaign and being quite ruthless about those big issues, they'll feel quite pleased about that, because that means that they're probably on the right track in terms of this being a good dress rehearsal for the next general election.
There were a lot of people, though, in the Labour Party, and I think some of the wider public as well, who looked at some of what Labour was doing in the campaign, and those adverts, I'm sure a lot of viewers will remember, that sort of implicated Rishi Sunak and saying he didn't care about certain kinds of offenders because of various different, crime rates and things, and how they'd changed. Extremely personal. Also suggestions of going after Rishi Sunak's wife. Now, do you think in the Labour movement there will be unease about that if that's how they run a general election?
Well, I think there's two questions there. Like, unease amongst the Labour movement, there's always a lot of unease amongst the Labour movement. The Labour movement's a broad church. There's lots of people who don't want Keir Starmer to do well, who are former Jeremy Corbyn supporters. So they're always going to criticise what Keir Starmer does. I mean, I think he and his team are setting out some quite ruthless red lines, if you pardon the pun, and they're also kind of showing, that they are prepared to sort of go in and really fight hard. And I think in the past, and I remember this from my own time working for Ed Miliband and others, like sometimes you did feel like Labour would turn up at a knife fight with a baguette, if it was like we're sort of not quite ready to really go in and fight hard. And I think Keir Starmer and his team are really, really focused on winning. Mm-hmm. However, and lots of caveats, and John Curtice, of course, will be all the expert in this, Labour still has such a big mountain to climb. If Keir Starmer gets the same swing that Tony Blair did in 1997, he only gets a working majority of one. And yes, there are things in his favour, the collapse of the SNP at the moment and the fact that Liz Truss caused a huge amount of damage to the Tory party. But there is still a long, long way for Labour to go. And I think these poll results will narrow as we get closer to the general election. And I think Rishi Sunak, even though, the tonight might be terrible for the Tories. You know, his own personal ratings are creeping up again. So Labour will be pleased, but there's no room for complacency.
And the general election is still, in political terms, centuries away. Mo, briefly to you, if Labour carries on setting out what Aisha described as ruthless red lines, what will the Tory response likely be?
I think they'll probably have a few things that they'll throw back at Labour as well. But it seems to me that the focus for the Conservatives and the government is to rebuild credibility after the mess that we saw under Liz Truss and the legacy issues from Boris Johnson. And shortly after that, we will try and see some vision for the future and probably a plan for what things would look like going forward. But you can't really do that until you build that credibility back. So you see the Prime Minister just trying to get on with delivery, trying to get on with addressing the issues that matter to people. But there are questions being asked amongst their backbenchers. Is that enough? Is that bold enough? Is that ambitious enough? And I think that debate will continue to rage within the party.
OK, Mo and Aisha, thanks very much for giving us your time this evening. Great to have you with us. Paul Scully, let's put that great to you then, straight to you. Bo Hussein says that people in the party already asking whose voices will get louder if what Rishi Sunak's trying to do is ambitious enough.
I think, look, he's set out those 5 points that are measurable. What he's doing, as Mo said, he's right to talk about the fact that we are talking about credibility. We're talking about, because it's all about confidence, not just confidence politically, but confidence economically. People look to governments, and they don't worry about some of the machinations and the mudslinging. It's what's happening to my mortgage, what's happening to the backlog, what's happening to the small boats, and these kind of things. And so that's what Rishi said he's going to be doing over this year. Clearly, as we get closer to a general election, you then need to start talking about, having regained that sort of confidence, you then need to start talking about what we're going to setting out stall for the next few years, the hopes of constituents and people across the country over the next few years. But you can only talk to that subject if you get the basics right, and that's what he's concentrating on at the moment.
But he would have to step it up a bit, you just said. Wes, you've looking pretty chipper so far, but I just wanted to ask you this. You know, Harlow Council, Redditch Council, Basildon Council, they've all been held by the Conservatives. Now, they are all parts of the country where, at a general election, Labour needs to be looking competitive, but the Tories have held them all.
Well, as we saw in Redditch, you know, there's improvement in our vote share. Redditch wasn't a target council for these elections. It will be a target seat for the general election. We have ruthlessly targeted these elections, and if we saw an 8% improvement, for example, that'd be the best result for Labour since 1997. So. There are always local variables. Thinking about one of those seats in Sunderland, won by the Greens, where I know one of the candidates and the issues very well, very local issues. There will be some of those results throughout the night where local factors are at play. But overall, I think this has been, a great campaign for Labour. And I think for the Conservatives, they've got a double punch in the gut, really, haven't they? They've been let down by a leader they didn't vote for. And he has spent the last few days trying to sort of manufacture a controversy around things like Sue Gray, the job of one person, rather than the jobs and the livelihoods and the cost of living for millions.
Sue and Keir manufactured that all among themselves.
It's not worked, has it? What time it might get to before somebody from Westminster mentions something that I think has been important to some people, but quite incomprehensible to a lot of people watching
the Conservatives' big message going into the election.
We're in a minute. We're going to take people to the news. But Sarah, before you leave us, you're leaving tonight with a spring in your step, it seems. But I suppose the bigger question for you is, if you have the kind of set of results that you get, what would that mean for you in the coming months and years?
I think it would just mean we'd be able to send a very positive message to the country that Liberal Democrats are, working for you in your communities. We're here, we're your local champions, and we really want to listen to the voters and really, really respond to their concerns. I would like to think that going into the next general election, however many political lifetimes in the future that is, people will, take another look at the Liberal Democrats. We are, in certain parts of the country, we are the main contenders in many, many Tory-held seats, and I want people to look at us and think, yes, going to vote for the Liberal Democrats because I think they're the right people to represent me in Parliament, and obviously we want more Lib Dem MPs in Parliament.
OK, well, you are leaving us with a smile on your face. Let's see if your colleagues through the night still have them by 6 a.m. But Sarah Olney, Wes Streeting, Paul Scully, thank you for being with us for the first hour of our coverage here on Elections 2023. As I said, we're about to go to the news, but I want to give you our total as we leave you for a few minutes. Our big tower tally there, Labour on 87, having gained 5 seats. The Liberal Democrats on 38, having gained 8, and the Conservatives on 37, having lost 12. Now, let's take a pause. The news with Laxmi Gopal.
Laura, thank you. Good evening. Here's a summary of the BBC News. As we've been hearing, counting is underway in the local elections in England, in one of the last major tests of public opinion before next year's general election. Voters have been deciding who will run services at 230 local councils, with around 8,000 seats up for grabs. Mayoral elections have also been taking place in Bedford, Leicester, Mansfield and Middlesbrough. Here's our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake.
Voters have given their verdict and the counting can begin. Ballots have been cast in towns, cities and rural areas to elect around 8,000 councillors across England who will decide how local services are run. Some last-minute campaigning from the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, who knows a strong showing from his party is needed to prove it can turn a lead in opinion polls into results. The Liberal Democrats are hoping to make gains from the Conservatives in their traditional territory, claiming voters are fed up with the Tories. There was no sign of Rishi Sunak on the doorstep, but the Conservatives are expecting a tough night, hoping only to limit their losses rather than count up the gains. In a first for elections in England, photo ID was required at polling stations, which left some unable to vote, but it's too soon to say what impact the change has had. Only around a quarter of the councils holding elections are counting votes overnight, so early results won't give anything like the full picture. But in the hours ahead, these local elections will be closely watched as a crucial test of the national political picture. Jonathan Blake, BBC News.
And all the local results will be available online, of course. To see who won in your local area, you can use our postcode checker, which is available on the BBC News website and on our app. In other news, Ukraine's Air Force has shot down one of its own drones, which it says had lost control above central Kyiv. There were explosions for around 15 to 20 minutes yesterday evening as air defence tried to shoot it down in an area near the president's office. The Air Force later admitted it was Ukrainian and had been destroyed to avoid undesirable circumstances. Members of the biggest rail workers' union, the RMT, have voted to renew its mandate for taking strike action. It's the third such vote in a dispute over pay and conditions, which began last year. It raises the prospect of strikes continuing until nearly the end of the year. A US court has ruled that the singer Ed Sheeran didn't copy Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On when composing Thinking Out Loud. The British musician had denied stealing elements of the song for his 2014 worldwide hit. Heirs of Marvin Gaye's co-writer argued that Sheeran, Warner Music Group and Sony Music Publishing owed them money for copyright infringement. Sheeran's legal team had argued that the melodies are different and the elements used in both songs are common in pop music. With the King's coronation fast approaching, people hoping to get the best in-person view on the day are camping in central London this evening as rehearsals and final preparations take place in and around Westminster Abbey. It's expected hundreds of thousands of people will line the route of the procession to and from the Abbey. It's only a short journey down the Mall and along Whitehall, and people are already positioning to get the best view. Meanwhile, the Prince and Princess of Wales took the new Elizabeth line on the tube down to Soho in central London and went to the pub. Well, we'll be back in an hour with the latest news updates, but for now it's back to our special election night coverage with Laura.
A warm welcome back to election 2023, just after 1 o'clock in the morning. And we've had a fair number of results in from local council elections happening right across England. More than 8,000 seats were up for grabs. We are going to, in the next hour, have some lively political conversation with our guests who've just joined us. Richard Holden, Transport Minister for the government, joins us. Bridget Phillipson, who wants to be the Education Secretary if Labour does win the general election, and Munira Wilson, who also speaks on education, but for the Liberal Democrats. You're all very welcome. Thank you for joining us. Now, before we do anything else, let's remind you of the total tally as these seats start to come in. You can see there that the Conservatives are a dozen seats down. Labour overall has gained 5 so far, and the Liberal Democrats are up by 8 seats. And we have just had another interesting result in Brentwood in Essex. Now, in the last hour, we were talking about Tory concerns that they might lose this council in Essex. Should be the kind of parts of the country where they're pretty confident of holding on, but actually we can confirm they have lost control of Brentwood Council. They've still got 17 seats more than the others, with 1 seat left to declare. You can see 17 there to the Liberal Democrats, 16. But then look at the change in the seats. The Tories have lost 2. The Liberal Democrats have gained 2. Then let's show you the vote share. Now, this is interesting. The Conservatives, 37%, and the Liberal Democrats, the largest share, on 41%. Labour down on 16. And let's look at the crucial change in the share of the vote. You can see it there. Labour up 5, the Conservatives down 4. That's the change, remember, since 2019, the last time these council elections were fought in May 2019, which is another political lifetime in so many ways. But let's hear about exactly what's happened in Brentwood with Harry Farley, who's on the ground there for us tonight. Harry, what's happened?
Yes, well, Laura, you're right. So Lib Dems have taken the Conservatives' majority. It's now no overall control. At the start of the night, I was speaking to a number of Conservatives here, and they thought they might just hang on. They had a wafer-thin majority of 3. They thought they might be able to protect that if they could win a couple of key wards. They haven't. The Conservatives, they are still the largest party, but they have lost their majority here in Brentwood. As you say, a part of the country where in general elections they're very comfortable. They tend to win these seats in the general elections pretty easily, but in the local elections here, the Lib Dems have pushed them very hard. They've taken away their majority, and it's now no overall control in Brentwood.
And what do you think was behind the result from the people you've spoken to?
There's a few factors here. Housing is a big thing here in Brentford. We're just outside the M25. It's a green belt area, and in the last few years, under the Conservative majority on the Borough Council, 2 big housing developments have been granted, and they've started to be built. And the Lib Dems campaigned hard against those developments, against new houses in this area. So we've been talking about housing a lot in the programme throughout the night as an issue that's both a national and a local one that voters come to the polls with. And housing is certainly a big issue for the Lib Dems in particular. Another key issue, the ultra-low emission zone, ULEZ, which is the tax on some vehicles in London. That has been pushed out to the edges of this area, so another key local issue there. But really, I think for the Lib Dems in particular, it was housing that they campaigned against those new developments in this area, and that's obviously has paid dividends for them. They've taken the Conservatives' majority off them, and it's now no overall control in Brentwood.
Harry, thanks very much indeed. Well, housing we had already touched on. Interesting, Harry mentioned there, though, the ULEZ. Now, if you don't live in a part of the country where there is one of these low emission zones already, believe me, they have been a source of big controversy. And by a happy coincidence, actually, the Roads and Local Transport Minister, Richard Holden, is with us in the studio. So we'll ask him about that in a few minutes. But I want to bring Chris Mason, our political editor, in at this moment. We're just 1:15. It's a lot of information coming in. We're cautious about the overall picture, but we are learning quite a lot, aren't we?
We are. So just to pick up on that conversation you're just having there on the issue of planning, it's fascinating seeing the influence that Harry was speaking to and political sources are acknowledging around the battle there in Essex on housing developments and how it would appear the Liberal Democrats were able to politically kind of weaponise that. We've seen, haven't we, the Cheshire and Amersham by-election of a couple of years ago, where planning a massive issue there as well, and such a source of political argument in so many, in particular, of those battles between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats in a ring of sort of suburban seats around London. Stepping back to the bigger picture, though, I mean, as you say, the numbers are still relatively small, almost as small as the hour of the night as we trundle on into the small hours. But we're beginning to get a sense, aren't we, of how things are panning out. So far, so expected, in that we're seeing Labour making progress, the Conservatives going backwards. Obviously, by the end of Friday, the extent to which that plays out will be the sort of defining factor in, I think, the overall headline of these elections. I think what's intriguing, and again, we've got to underline it, haven't we, and put it in bold and italics and all the rest of it. It's very, very early. What is intriguing is there's a beginning of a sense that perhaps Labour are getting relatively close to some of the opinion polls that have suggested they have a reasonable lead. But how does that carry on through the night? Who knows? There is one heck of a lot still to come.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's just address that issue of the ULEZ with our Roads Minister, Richard Holden. Just on this specific issue, it's interesting there, people in one part of the country thinking that changes that Conservatives have made to charge people to come in to pay for driving their cars have cost you votes.
Well, they're not changes the Conservatives have made, they're changes that the Labour Mayor of London's made. I think it's particularly interesting in Brentwood that despite the Lib Dems voting for ULEZ in London, they're actually campaigning against it in Brentwood. Just like at a national level, they campaign for more house building, but on a local level, they campaign against it.
But you're being punished, and our reporter on the ground has told us there very clearly that people are unhappy with the fact that this has happened on your national watch.
I don't think well, I think you can see there's been no massive Labour surge there in Brentwood. This is...
but you lost control.
That's true. We're down a couple of seats in Brentwood. But you look at other parts of Essex, in Harlow, that's a Labour-Tory marginal area. Conservatives look like they're doing quite well there. In Basildon, which Labour actually took to overall control in 2019 under Jeremy Corbyn, you're reporting at the moment that the Conservatives are holding on to control there in Basildon. So I think it's one thing when you're against the Lib Dems, who we all know say one thing on a national level and another at a local level because they can usually avoid that scrutiny. That's not quite the same for the Labour Party, in fairness, who do get that scrutiny on a national level.
But when it comes to something like housing targets, which we've also heard from several places in the country tonight, is also a big problem. Your party has got big problems on this. You've got a whole load of MPs who are quoted in the newspapers in the last few days being very critical of the national leadership for dropping local housing targets, acknowledging that lots of people, including in the Conservative Party, think that you've got nowhere near building enough houses. So you're split on that.
Well, you can see what's down there in Brentwood, exactly what we've been doing. We've actually been fulfilling what people want with more housing. But obviously these will be weaponised at a local level by Lib Dems who face two ways on every issue they can.
Well, let's put that accusation to Munira. I mean, he's accusing you of facing two ways.
Well, I think the Tories are struggling this evening. Look, on ULEZ, I'd like to just correct what Richard said. There wasn't even a vote on this at the London Assembly. Sadiq Khan has done this by his executive powers. And one of the things we've been very clear about, whilst we support cleaning up London's air, absolutely, the timing and the speed at which this has been done is far too fast, terrible in the middle of a cost of living crisis. And we've actually amended the Mayor's budget to put more money to help people change their cars and put better public transport in place, but unfortunately the Mayor of London has blocked that. So we haven't been facing two ways at all. And actually, as the Transport Minister, one of the things I'd like to say to Richard is that the government has put money into helping people change their cars in all sorts of parts of the country, like in Manchester and Bristol. But outside of London and the areas that border onto London, the Liberal Democrats have called for that, and they won't support that.
Except when it comes
to... How much are you going to put into that? How much tax do you want to raise to pay for that?
Well, look, there are plenty of ways that you can pay for that, whether that's by rolling back things like the cut in bankers' surcharge and increasing the windfall tax. If you are serious about
is that an actual policy proposal, or is that just something you're making up as you go along?
If you're serious about cleaning up the air and tackling climate change, then you would invest in those sorts of schemes. Look,
clearly, what we're seeing in Brentwood,
got the most aggressive net zero
what we're
targets in the
seeing in
world.
Brentwood and across the country in Conservative-facing areas is that people are fed up with the Tories, whether it's the cost of living crisis, whether it's sewage, whether it's NHS waiting lists. That's what I've been hearing. I've been out in that blue wall campaigning in places like Easter and Walton and elsewhere in Surrey and in Hertfordshire, and it's very, very clear that people are fed up with the Conservatives. They're sending them a message, and they're coming over to us, and many of them are also just frankly staying at home because they're too ashamed to vote for the Conservative Party. People feel taken for granted. I met lifelong Conservative voters in Dominic Raab's patch in Easter and Walton who said, absolutely not, I can't support the Conservatives.
Bridget Phillipson, we're getting some news from Hartlepool Council. Now, that is still in no overall control. What do you make of that? I mean, isn't that exactly the kind of place where Labour has to be making progress? That was Labour for so long, grabbed sensationally by the Conservatives under Boris Johnson. Don't you really need to be making big progress in parts of the country like that?
We have made big progress tonight in Hartlepool. We've taken a number of seats there. Because of the fact we elect on the basis of thirds, it's more difficult to get to a position of taking control. But we've made some really important gains in Hartlepool and actually right across the country where I've been campaigning. You know, I'm confident that we're going to see gains this evening in those key battleground seats ahead of the next general election. I mean, that's what I'm most interested in looking at, not so much the numbers of councillors or the kind of percentages, but actually where are we making gains and how does that align with the seats that we need to take in order to form a government at the next general election?
Does that mean then that the geography is actually more important to you than the overall total? Because there are some very important benchmarks though that you have to hit, are there not?
No, absolutely. It's the geography that really does matter to us. Of course, we want to see more councillors and, you know, we are in the process of electing more councillors this evening. But actually, it's the geography. It's those key battleground seats, whether that's Swindon or Hartlepool, Darlington, Telford. You know, they are the areas I'll be looking to see how Labour is doing. And on the basis of Hartlepool so far, it looks to be a really strong result. And actually in Richard's backyard in Durham, we took a seat from the Conservatives there in the by-election this evening too. So we're making progress in the north, and I look forward to seeing some really good results in key battleground seats in the south and the southeast this evening too.
Well, you are almost neighbours, not near neighbours. You are almost neighbours, but I'm not sure that you're ever going to be around, popping around for a cup of tea. Thank you all three of you for now. We'll be back with you in a little bit. But Reeta, let's have a deeper delve into some of the numbers coming through.
I've got a couple of councils here for you, Laura, that are really interesting to watch. They're both still counting, but it's always good to see what's going on behind the scenes. So Colchester in Essex, you can see it flashing there. This is an interesting council because it's been hung for the past quarter of a century. And it's quite a rare council in many ways because all three of the main parties are competitive here. They're really sort of neck and neck. And as you can see, with 11 seats still to declare, the Conservatives on 14 and Labour and the Lib Dems tying on 12. Let's have a look and see, though, what's happened to the share of the vote on the basis of what we've got in so far. Conservatives down by 6 percentage points, Labour up by 9 and the Lib Dems up by 8, and actually the Greens and Independents suffering there. So we'll keep an eye on Colchester, but this is looking like good news both for Labour and the Liberal Democrats. I want to show you also Hull, which we've mentioned already. A very tight race here between the Lib Dems and Labour. There are still 15 seats to declare, 29 seats for the winning post, and at the moment the Lib Dems are on 24 and Labour on 18. Let's take a look at what's happened to the share of the vote. Lib Dems up 5 percentage points and Labour up 2, Greens down 5%. So this result will be coming in soonish, I hope, but it gives you an indication of what's going on. And in both cases, it looks like quite good news for the Liberal Democrats. Laura.
Thank you, Reeta. And I know that Hull is somewhere that Labour was fighting very hard to get back after the Lib Dems did well to take it a few years ago, as Reeta was just explaining to us. Let's go back to Medway. Now, we were talking to our reporter there, Anna Collinson, a while ago, explaining why that part of the world was interesting politically. But we can talk to the MP there, Raymond Chishti, Conservative MP, who joins us from Gillingham. Now, Conservatives are already looking a bit downcast tonight. At the moment, that council is held by the Conservatives. It's been held by the Conservatives since 2003. Does your glum face, Raymond, suggest that that might be going to change tonight?
Well, no, it's certainly not a glum face. What I'm trying to say is trying to listen to what you were saying. And you're right, we've held the council since 2003. It's been a fantastic local Conservative-run council where you have weekly rubbish and recycling collection, excellent green spaces in the area, and you've got libraries across the Medway towns which have been, providing excellent service to the local community. So what we have now is these elections are taking place after, over 20 years of a Conservative administration, 13 years of a Conservative government. So yes, of course, we are going to get some challenges, here in Medway, like the rest of the country. But what I would say is I'm the Member of Parliament for Gillingham and Rainham. And Medway is composed of 3 parliamentary constituencies. I've been out across the constituency in Gillingham today, and I expect, to retain all the, the councillors in Gillingham or Rainham. There might be a tight call on one here and there, but I expect to retain, all the sitting Conservative councillors in Gillingham and Rainham who've been working exceptionally hard. And in the wider Medway towns, you have, a redrawn local boundaries, which will be a key factor in these local elections.
And in your part of that area, you think the Conservatives will hold on to the seats. What about the other parts of the area held by your colleagues?
Well, I think what I've just said on that is with regards to the wider Medway towns, Gillingham and Rainham, I expect, from having been out on the doorsteps with our brilliant local candidates to maintain those council seats. There'll be, challenges with one here and there, but I expect to maintain all the sitting councillors we have in Gillingham and Rainham. Brilliant team. The rest of the Medway towns, you have redrawn local boundary changes, by the Boundary Commission, which are independently done, and that, favours the Labour Party here in the Medway towns. So that will be a factor in the other part of the Medway towns. And I think on that, it would be only right that you speak to the Members of Parliament for those areas, but for me to comment on Gillingham and Rainham, in this interview.
You have expressed concerns previously, however, about making sure that the Conservative Party is still trying its utmost to represent and court votes in all parts of England. And as an MP for the South East, do you have concern that the focus on levelling up, the focus on holding parts of the country that chose Brexit last time and chose Conservatives for the first time could mean sometimes that the South East and constituencies like yours might lose out?
I think the way you've put that point is absolutely spot on. The government has put forward the levelling up agenda for the country across the board to level up all parts of the country. And that is absolutely right. But what I've said before, and I've said it across the board to the government and in articles, you cannot level up the north at the expense of the south. And for us here in Gillingham and Rainham and in the south, we need our fair share of allocation of resources. For example, levelling up funding. We've not had that here in Gillingham and Rainham in the 2 rounds that we've had. So for me, I want to make sure the government, when they look at the wider strategy, ensures that, when we level up the rest of the country in the north, we also level up the southeast and ensure that we get here in Gillingham and Rainham and the wider Medway towns our fair share allocation of resources, whether it's regeneration funding, level 3, or it's with regards to supporting, a new hospital buildings programme here in the Medway town. So yes, you are absolutely right. I have said that the government needs to ensure that its strategy of levelling up ensures that the southeast of England gets its fair share, and I'll make sure that view gets taken back to the Prime Minister and any minister in government to make sure that's done fairly and properly.
But if it is not, and you raising that does suggest you have concern that it has not been done adequately enough, how important is it, do you think, that they switch that focus in order to be able to keep seats like yours when it comes to the general election?
Well, I think what I would say on that specific point, these are local elections that we're talking about. We're out another 14 months from a general election. But absolutely, the government needs to look at these results with great care and listen to members of Parliament who say, we do not want any favours from the government. We need fair allocation of resources, and that means regeneration funding here in Gillingham and Rainham, with the High Street, with the town centres, and with regards to the hospital buildings programmes raised in government. And we will fight for that at every level, irrespective of who the Prime Minister, who the Cabinet is, because that needs to be done fairly, and we need to make sure, as members of Parliament, that money and those resources get done evenly across the board, and we get it here in Gillingham and Rainham. And these results, in the wider Medway towns, will send a clear message to the government. If it's predicted where we're going on the wider scale, then we need to relook at how we address those challenges on allocation of resources.
Raymond Chishti, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, let's put that straight to a government minister. That's one of your MPs saying very, very clearly that the government needs to switch its focus more to parts of the country that feel a bit neglected, because there's been so much focus on the north of England.
Well, I don't agree with Ray on that. I think the truth is that right across the country there will always be pockets, and there are pockets of Medway, like the Chatham area, which do require extra focus and extra support, and there are parts of the country, and the Prime Minister said that, which will require that extra support in all sorts of different ways and different areas.
But he's saying they're not getting it. That's the point he's making.
Well, I would just say, if you go down to the Medway towns, you've got a great train line link straight into central London. You've got a motorway right past the bottom of the Medway towns, which takes you straight into central London. Yes, there are obviously local challenges. I know, having campaigned down there several years ago, actually, the hospital has been a big issue down there. And Ray, we're seeing some of his colleagues. Ray was on the local council down before. He was a member of Parliament. Will obviously feel some of those losses keenly. But I'd say that we need to look at the broader picture and the fact that since the back end of last year, we've made a massive strides in stabilising and turning around what's been a difficult economic situation, especially following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Huge amount of support for families across the country. But no, I think there will always be specific issues in specific areas which MPs will want to campaign on. It's the same as I do in my own constituency.
But he's making a general point, though. He's not talking about specific issues. He was making
he was raising specific issues, Laura.
But he's making a general point very clearly that he and other Conservatives feel that some of the areas in the south of the country that have traditionally had more attention from the Conservatives in government have lost out, partly because of the switch in focus to parts of the country.
I just don't agree with that.
You just don't agree with him?
No.
Bridget?
I think everyone's pretty fed up everywhere. I mean, I think it will be news to the people that I represent that they're getting a great deal from the government's so-called levelling up agenda. And clearly there's dissatisfaction in large parts of the south of England too. I mean, I do have to... Richard's doing an admirable job here, but I do have to say that when you talk about the economic situation that we've had since the end of last year, it was, after all, your government's own mini budget that caused all of that instability and chaos, and that has caused us so many problems. And, right throughout this campaign, we've been talking about the cost of living, about the challenges that people are facing right now. The Conservatives have been nowhere on that. I mean, that has been the single biggest issue that people will raise on the doorsteps.
I mean, it's just totally untrue. We put £92 billion into supporting households with energy bills over the last few years, which I think was actually broadly supported by Labour in Parliament. I don't think they voted against it, or for more, actually. So I don't know, what did you want to do differently?
Well, we would have done the windfall tax differently and have frozen council tax, for one example. But when you speak to people...
You've not done that when you're in local government, have you?
We would be doing that right now if we were in government. What you hear time and again from people on the doors is that they're putting back food when they go shopping, that they can't afford to pay their bills, they're worried about heating their homes, and they feel that the government just aren't listening and don't have an idea about just how difficult it is for people right now. And this is families and pensioners right across the board, people who never imagined they'd be in a position that they'd be struggling to such a degree. And the way that the government have approached this, just no understanding about how hard things are for people like right now, and a complete rejection, I think, of some pretty straightforward measures that would really make life easier for people. And, we've fought a really strong and positive campaign about the different choices that we would be making in government right now, and that would deliver real benefits for people at a really, really tough time. But I do have to come back to this point. The Conservatives crashed the economy. They caused all of this instability and chaos. People are paying more on their mortgages as a direct result of the decisions that the Conservative Party took both last year and over 13 years.
I mean, you know that in, say, the United States or in Canada, they've actually seen greater interest rate rises than we have here in the UK. The European Union is just a couple of, very slightly behind where we are. The entire world's seen that change. I mean, are you saying that in Canada or America they're doing a worse job because their interest rates have gone up more than here?
I'd say good luck selling that to people on the doors.
There is a problem. Well, there is a problem for you, Richard, though, isn't there? I mean, you can sit and say that the Conservatives have put huge amounts of money into things like energy bills. That is true. Huge tens of billions of pounds of taxpayers' money going into it. And yet, if you can also sit and say that, and voters just say, things are still hard, things are still difficult, that doesn't solve your political problem, does it?
No, and they are hard and they are difficult. And I think what people are looking for is who's going to lead the country, who can they trust to lead the country through what is a difficult time, and I think, usually the Labour Party accept that most of those headwinds have been caused by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And when you
there was a market meltdown in this country under the Conservative Prime Minister who was out 44 days later. I mean, Ukraine has obviously been a very significant factor, but that's not everything that's happened.
It stabilised very quickly. When you look at the actual interest rates, for example, compare us, the Canada, US, Europe, it's in a very similar situation right across the board there. What I would say is people will, at the next election, general election, are going to be looking for who is on their side and who's the right person to lead the country. That's going to be a choice between Rishi Sunak, who's set forward some priorities around the economy, around stopping the boats, around getting hospital waiting lists under control, and Keir Starmer, who seems to change his mind on every policy, whether he's facing the Labour membership or the country.
And yet the Liberal Democrats, the third party in these English local elections, the third big party in these English local elections, might have a word or two to say about that as well, with both of them.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I agree with Bridget. The cost of living is absolutely coming up on the doorstep, and people have seen their mortgages go up as a result of the Conservatives crashing the economy under the disastrous leadership of Liz Truss. But also health services. It's something that I've heard time and again. Just today, actually, knocking on doors in Walton, down in Surrey, people saying really struggling to get a GP appointment. We know that sort of ambulance waiting times across the country are a big issue. People are concerned about their local environment and sewage in our rivers and waterways, and the fact that Conservatives, frankly, are not taking action on the big water companies because of that. And that complete dereliction of duty and people feeling like they've been taken for granted by the Conservatives for so long. I think there's a real palpable anger on the doorstep that we're really picking up when we're out talking to people.
OK, Munira, thank you very much for now. Bridget and Richard, thank you very much for now indeed. I want to let you know that if you are one of the people who likes to look on your phone while you're also watching the TV, we all know we do it, there is a huge amount of information there, yeah, not just you, on the BBC website, the live page, streaming all the tips and trends and information coming in from right around the country. That's there for you throughout the night. Don't turn off the TV and just look at your phone. So keep watching as well as looking on the live stream. But there's a huge amount of info there. Chris providing his analysis as we go through the night on text form as well as here on TV. And just to bring you one tip, a Lib Dem source has just said to me that they have held Hull with 3 gains. The Liberal Democrats apparently gaining 3 to hold on to Hull, which Labour were trying to nab back from them, but we haven't got official confirmation of that yet, so we'll bring that to you. Well, I think out of the corner of my eye I can see Munira nodding along, so it seems indeed that the Liberal Democrats have held Hull, held Labour off there. Let's talk, though, about one of the other parties involved, the Green Party. We mentioned them a little while ago, and so far the Greens are up 2 seats overall, but it seems as if they're down a little bit in some of the wards where they did so well the last time. So it looks at this early stage like they might not be able to match the very good performance that they put in 2019. But let's see what their co-leader, Carla Denyer, has to say about that. Carla, welcome to the programme. It's good to have you with us. From what you've heard so far, are you a little bit down, as our numbers suggest?
No, I'm still feeling very optimistic about our chances this evening. It is, of course, very early in the night, and we know that many of our target seats, places like Herefordshire and Mid-Suffolk, are not going to be declaring until the afternoon tomorrow. So I'm expecting, based on the responses we've been getting on the doorstep, people are coming to us really from across the political spectrum and in all kinds of different areas of the country. People are angry with the way the Conservatives are running the country into the ground, but are also telling us that they don't feel inspired by Starmer's Labour. So many people are coming to the Greens voting for us for the first time because they want to be inspired. They want to vote for a party they agree with. And we're standing a record number of candidates this time around. And we think a lot of people are going to vote Green for the first time and get more Green councillors than ever before.
Your colleague Adrian Ramsey said on Sunday to us here at the BBC that he thought you were looking at or hopeful of getting about 100 seats. Does that still feel roughly on course?
Yes, I think so. So we are defending a record number of seats this time around. We're defending 280 seats, which is more than ever before, but we're not just aiming to hold steady. We are expecting to make substantial gains. We've already made gains in South Tyneside, where we were already the official opposition, but we've cemented that now. And yeah, there's a lot more exciting councils from places like Lancaster, Mid Suffolk that I mentioned earlier, which is a council where we have the potential to not just become the administration, but have a majority with over 50% of the council seats. And if we do that, then that will be the first council, not just in the UK, but in the Northern Hemisphere where that's taken place. So we'll see, but I'm feeling optimistic.
And I just want to ask you about another council. Now, you have been running Brighton and Hove Council, now not as a majority, as you hope to be in Mid-Suffolk, but Labour, I know, have been working hard to try to get control of Brighton and Hove Council down on the south coast back from the Greens. What's your sense of whether you'll be disappointed there and lose control?
It's far too early to tell for Brighton and Hove, but I'm really proud of the hard work that our Green councillors in a minority administration on the council there have been doing, getting investment to help prevent homelessness, to improve public transport, walking and cycling in the city, and yeah, they've been doing fantastic work, and they are, although they are our only sole administration at the moment, we're actually part of the administration in 17 councils in England, and we are the official opposition in a further 10, and we're expecting both of those numbers to go up significantly when we get the results in tomorrow.
OK, Carla, thank you very much. Good to have you with us, and we'll keep a close eye on lots of those interesting races where the Greens are a factor around the country over the night. Now, a couple of minutes ago, we brought you what seemed like news that Hull had been held with 3 extra seats by the Liberal Democrats. Now, it is a big city, northeast of England, very important to the people who live there, big area of the country. Let's take a look at the seats as they're still counting. The Lib Dems there on 27, Labour on 18. Now, there are still 12 seats to declare, but you can see there that the Lib Dems, we can confirm that they've gained 2 and that Labour have lost 2. Let's take a look at the vote share so far. 52% for the Liberal Democrats, 39% for the Labour Party, the Conservatives way behind on 6, and the change since 2019, so often this is the critical thing, 6% up by the Liberal Democrats, but they're still counting in Hull, OK? These are not complete figures, but 6% up, and Labour only up 1%. So let's go straight there and talk to Sarah Sanderson, who's there for the BBC tonight. Sarah, it sounds like a really exciting moment for the Liberal Democrats. Have they all got broad smiles on their faces?
Oh, they certainly have, Laura. Good morning. It was at the start of this local election, it was a bitter battle simply between the Labour Party and the Lib Dems. And that's because last year, the Lib Dems took control of Hull City Council after a decade-long reign by Labour. And as you say, the Lib Dems tonight, the declarations are still coming through, but the Lib Dems have taken 2 seats off Labour. Jubilant celebrations from the Lib Dems. The Lib Dems are now on 31, Labour are on 24. There's still a vacancy which has been held by Labour. That's due to come in. And an independent retiring seat. We've got another declaration coming in now. But it's safe to say the Lib Dems have held on to Hull. And given last year, the vote in Hull, voter turnout was 23.5%. That was the lowest amongst unitary authorities in the country. This year's turnout is 22.01%, a lower turnout. But in Hull, Laura, those votes are heading to the Lib Dems. And as you say, they've held on to the council. Let's see where we go from here. But happy faces with the Lib Dems.
And why do you think that's happened?
Well, I think, and I think a lot of people will say this, in the last year that Labour were in power, they made a rather unpopular decision to extend the bus lanes and put cycle lanes within the bus lanes and other parts of the city. And I have to say, it caused a lot of congestion. Traffic slowed down, people were unhappy. People decided to turn their votes to the Lib Dems last year because they said to the voters they were the listening party. They told the voters they would talk to them before making any changes, and it was quite a controversial move by Labour what they did. They were trying to improve the city, they were trying to make a difference, but it didn't go down too well for the people of Hull, and I think that was a persuasive factor for the votes when the Lib Dems took power last year. What the Lib Dems will do with those bus lanes and those cycle lanes in Hull for the next couple of years, we're not quite sure. But I can say this, they'll be celebrating tonight because they retained control of Hull City Council, and, well, now we'll see whether they keep those votes in the coming years.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. And we don't often on a local election programme get glimpses of many of the declarations. They don't go in for the big grand declarations where MPs have to stand nervously wondering about their future, and we see those huge moments of drama, or those memorable ones that you stay up for. But it was nice to have a little flavour of a cheer with some very happy Liberal Democrats there in Hull, where they have held on despite Labour's effort to get back with them. Chris, when we think about the Lib Dems, just think about them for a moment. You know, they're in a tricky position, aren't they? Because they lost that status of being the third biggest party. They went down to really a tiny rump in Parliament. Did they see tonight as a really strategic opportunity for them?
Yes, and seeing it as a point they hope that their coalition years recede sufficiently far in the rearview mirror for plenty of their former voters to perhaps return. Plenty of Liberal Democrats will talk proudly about their time in coalition government, but the numbers back in 2015, near apocalypse, sort of speak for themselves. And
it's quite a long time ago,
exactly, and had massive consequences, obviously in shrivelling their representation at Westminster. It's edged up a bit since then, but not vastly. That has meant they get much less media attention, and so they've been trying to build their way back. What's fascinating about the situation in Hull there, where they've done well, is it's one of those areas, and there aren't all that many, where there's a tussle between the Lib Dems and Labour. So much of the focus with the Liberal Democrat battlegrounds is often with the Conservatives, often in a ring of seats and council areas around London. Very, very few Westminster seats are a Labour Lib Dem battleground, Sheffield Hallam being one of
classic.
them. And there we see in Hull that battle between the Lib Dems and Labour, where the Lib Dems have built themselves up as a prominent opposition voice and obviously gone beyond that in terms of the local authority.
You can see, though, that they have been this time around really trying to, I suppose, maybe trying some new ways of cutting through. You know, we used to have Ed Davey, I think he started off with a small hammer for a blue door, and he ended up in this campaign. I wonder if we can show the pictures, actually driving a giant tractor towards bales of hay, the sort of metaphorical Tory blue wall, to use that jargon, that he wanted to smash through. And yet, the big thing for them last time round, see, I couldn't resist it. And we haven't even had dogs at polling stations yet, but that is coming at some point, I promise you, in the depths of the night. For Ed Davey, you know, the Lib Dems previously were so much built their identity around what happened during Brexit. You know, even at the last general election, they went in being the Remain party. Is that something now that they still like to talk about? Or actually... Yeah. Not
really. No, they don't. I mean, so often, if we go back even, you know, best part of 20, 25 years, so often the Liberal Democrats have been associated, haven't they, at key elections with individual, simple to understand, one-line policies, whether it be about Brexit or in the past about penny on income tax for provision for education, for instance, tuition fees,
their opposition to the Iraq War, even if you go back. Yeah.
Indeed. That's less the case now, which causes, I think, some nervousness from some. On the Brexit point, what's fascinating is how politics does seem to have moved on, at least as far as plenty of the big parties at Westminster. The SNP would still make an argument that they would want to talk about Brexit. But as far as Labour, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats are concerned, a real desire to move on, driven by, they would argue, a sense that lots of voters want to move on, however strongly held their view on Brexit might have been that they want to focus on other things, not least because, as our politicians will be the first to say tonight, issues like the cost of living are just so much more prominent in people's minds, and perhaps the sort of lethargy from people who are worn out by the noise of those Brexit arguments over the last couple of years. Just got a couple of other tidbits to bring you, Laura, in the last few minutes. Conservatives a bit more upbeat in Dudley and Sandwell in the West Midlands. Key battleground, the West Midlands, of course, come a general election. They're more upbeat there after their pessimism a little in other spots. In Hartlepool, we were talking about Hartlepool a few minutes ago. Hartlepool remains under no overall control. Labour were 1 seat short of a majority there. And just to give you a sense of the tightness of margins in some of these races, in one ward, Labour lost by 2 votes after several recounts, those votes denying them the majority that they thought they would get. So that council remains under no overall control, with Labour gaining 6, the Conservatives down to them being 1 short. In Redditch, another key battleground in a general election context, a Conservative hold, again no change, but Labour gaining 5 seats. So we're back to that point about extent. You know, to what extent is Labour moving forward? To what extent are the Conservatives going backwards? One final one whilst I'm talking, and then I promise I will shut up. Labour have gained 7 seats in Tamworth in the Midlands. The Conservatives losing it.
Well, there we go. I was just about to tell people about that, because Tamworth, council in the Midlands, also interesting for another reason. The MP there, Chris Pincher, was somebody who was close to Boris Johnson. You might remember he was involved in the pretty traumatic for the Conservatives final weeks of Boris Johnson's time in office. He had to resign after allegations were made about his behaviour, and he is going as an MP. And you can see in his local area the Conservatives have lost control of the council. The Tories have 14 seats, Labour 10, Independents with 6, and I want to show you the change. Tories down 6, Labour up 7. Now, as ever, wouldn't it be amazing if we were able to get into the polling booth and ask everybody individually what was in their minds when they make their decision? But after all the controversy around Chris Pincher in the national headlines and his decision to quit, you can't help but wonder if there has actually been an impact on how people have chosen to vote. And you can see there that resulting in Conservative support falling away in Tamworth. Now, Chris was talking a couple of minutes ago then about Brexit having been, you know, that strong line that carved out how people made their decisions politically in this country for such a long time. Whatever your view was, it was certainly became a very much part of people's political identity, with huge sway over how they voted, culminating probably in the election result in 2019, that huge majority for Boris Johnson. But what kind of impact is it having tonight on how people are making their decisions? Is it perhaps fading a little bit, as Chris was suggesting, and probably quite a lot of people in the Westminster parties wish it would? Reeta, can you take us through that?
Well, we've got enough information, Laura, even though the night is young. We have got enough information in terms of how people are voting to be able to analyse this. So we've got councils by Brexit vote, and we've divided them up into councils where there was a high Remain vote in 2016 versus those with a high Leave vote in 2016. And this is based on the change since 2019, because as we keep saying, most of these seats were last fought in 2019 when Brexit was still a very salient issue. Theresa May was trying to push her Brexit legislation through Parliament. It was all very turbulent. Now, we've taken this information from what we call key wards. These are hundreds of wards across the country where we collect information over time about how people are voting, what is happening to the share of support for each of the main political parties. And you can see that so far, Labour is up by 7 percentage points, Lib Dem's up by 2, Conservatives have dropped a little bit, and the Independents have gone right down. Now, in high Remain vote areas, you can see that the Labour Party has picked up by 4 percentage points, but compare that to the high Leave vote areas where Labour's advantage is double that. They are plus 8% in high Leave areas. Look at the Independent vote there, down by 13%. Now, there will have been a lot of UKIP voters within that. And it does suggest, doesn't it, that some of those, a significant proportion of those UKIP voters have drifted back to Labour. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that Labour's picked up more seats, more councillors, or even more councils in those areas, but it does mean that there is a renewed enthusiasm, if you like, for Labour in the highly voting councils on the basis of what we know so far. Laura.
Reeta, thank you very much. Really interesting to see how that is all unfolding. Right, let's talk to Sir John Curtice to see if he can give us an overview, if at this point we can make any sort of more concrete assumptions or conclusions than we did perhaps an hour ago. So, John, from what we are seeing now at nearly 2 a.m, time is whizzing by, the Conservatives are losing, I think, around 1 in 3 of their seats. Does that mean that they could be on course to meet that 1,000-seat loss, which is something they like to talk about as being likely, but in reality was more like a pretty much a worst-case scenario?
I think the way I would put it, Laura, is that as of 2 o'clock this morning, the Conservatives cannot be sure that they won't end up losing 1,000 seats. I don't think I want to say more than that. It is worth perhaps, however, explaining why maybe in the end their expectation management has not necessarily worked out in the way that they were hoping. If we actually look at the swing since 2019 from Conservative to Labour, it's settling down pretty consistently now, down to around the 4% mark, sometimes a little bit less. So if you take the 7% Labour up and add to it the 0.2% drop in the Conservatives and divide by 2, we're roughly at a 4% swing from Conservative to Labour. Now that, in truth, is a little bit lower than we might have anticipated, given the state of the opinion polls. It's certainly rather less than the swing that was being assumed when Colin Runnings and Michael Thrasher, the well-known local election experts, came up with that original estimate that the Tories might lose 1,000 seats. So why might it still happen? Well, the answer lies in the third column. You will see that the Liberal Democrats are up by a couple of points. That's pretty consistent now. And that while maybe in the end we will discover that maybe the Conservatives don't lose quite so much to Labour, as some people are anticipating, they are at risk of ending up losing more to the Democrats. Indeed, you will notice if you go and look at the scoreboard of gains and losses in terms of seats, that at the moment the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party are pretty much sharing the gains between them. So it may well be in the end it's not so much simply Sir Keir Starmer who might be causing embarrassment to the Labour Party so far as the 1,000 gains is concerned, but it might be also Sir Ed Davey, oh yes, and that tractor that you were showing us a little while ago, Laura. But I think my feeling about that tractor, of course, is I think Sir Ed Davey was desperate to prove that he had an even bigger tractor than Boris Johnson, because you remember during the 2019 general election, the way in which Mr Johnson illustrated that to get Brexit done was indeed to drive a tractor not through a hay bale, but I think through some plastic bricks. Maybe Sir Ed Davey believes that his, at least, is slightly more environmental friendly than the one that Boris Johnson had 3 years ago.
Sir John, thank you very much indeed. And I have to say, I witnessed Boris Johnson's tractor and it was enormous, driving through that wall of polystyrene bricks, as Sir John has recalled correctly. But I didn't in real life see Ed Davey's tractor. I've only seen that in the pictures. So we can't give a qualitative, definitive answer on that question that Sir John was raising. Really interesting. And if we were therefore to sketch out very, very carefully some headlines from what Sir John was saying, he was sort of suggesting that what we're seeing so far is quite a slump for the Conservatives, a step forward from Labour, but not a stride, and the Liberal Democrats also taking some decent steps forward. But it's early. It's 2 a.m. We've got a fair amount of information coming in, but by no means is this yet the complete picture. But based on where we're at, let's get the